everybody. Hi. If we can just work our way to get seated and get started. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a workshop today on assessing the role of the industrial sector in contributing to California's statewide carbon neutrality goals. We have an excellent lineup of panelists here to discuss the technologies and the associated economic considerations for decarbonizing industry. Thanks to these panelists. We appreciate the time and effort that you put into being here today. We at CARB are here to listen to you and learn about the latest thinking in these areas. And I'm looking forward to having the initial conversation and hearing the different viewpoints that you're bringing to these topics. I'm Mark Cipolla. I'm manager of the allowance allocation section in CARB's Cap and Trade program. I'll be giving a brief overview of today's workshop in a moment, but let me start by sharing some housekeeping announcements. Note the room exits in the back. If we have a building alarm, we're required to evacuate immediately. Please take your valuables, go down the stairs, and exit the building. Do not use the elevators. Please relocate outside in Cesar Chavez Park, which is diagonally across the street. And then just wait for the all clear signal. A drinking fountain and restrooms are on this floor, out the doors, past the stairs and to the left, past the green glass sculpture, and food services available downstairs. The first link here on the slide goes to the presentation slides that are posted online. You can also find here the slides that will be presented by each of our panelists. Also at this link, you can submit and view comments related to this workshop. The informal comment period will open today and close after 15 days on July 23rd. Today's just the first step in the discussion. You're encouraged to continue the conversation through submitting written comments. You can also find the agenda for the workshop posted at the first link. Our first session on economic considerations of industrial emissions reduction is planned to run for about an hour and 45 minutes. We'll take a short break and then pick up with a second session focused on potential technologies to decarbonize industry. We hope to wrap up around 4:45. This workshop is being webcast. The webcast can be accessed at the second link. We have some key statutes and executive orders that guide the state's climate targets. In 2006, AB 32 set our initial 2020 target to return to 1990 greenhouse gas emissions levels. Then SB 32 called for a 40% reduction in statewide GHG emissions below 1990 levels by 2030. CARB's 2017 scoping plan lays out a cost-effective and achievable path for achieving this target. The 2030 target is on the path to achieving the goals of reducing GHG emissions 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Both last year's executive order calling for carbon neutrality by 2045 and the climate science presented in the latest IPCC special report require us to find ways to reduce GHGs from fossil fuels and emphasize our need to focus on our natural and working lands and other sequestration opportunities. Carbon neutrality will require both reductions in GHG emissions as well as increased carbon sinks. Our thinking about how to approach the climate change is evolving. The concept of carbon neutrality is gaining importance. The concept is that to address climate change, the carbon dioxide and other GHG emissions generated by sources such as vehicles, power plants, and industrial processes must be less than or equal to the amount of carbon dioxide that is stored both in natural sinks, such as forests, and by mechanical sequestration, such as through carbon capture and sequestration. The magnitude of the climate change impacts will depend on when carbon neutrality is achieved. The IPCC special report released in late 2018 finds that to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to both reduce GHG emissions and remove carbon from the atmosphere. We need to reach global carbon neutrality by mid-century. The report also indicates that on a global scale, some regions may remain net emitters, while others are better suited to be net sinks. In California, we have an executive order that calls for carbon neutrality by 2045, consistent with the IPCC report. This executive order introduces the concept of balancing carbon emissions and carbon sequestration within the state. To meet the challenge laid out in the IPCC special report, We need our GHG emissions flux to be at zero or net negative, where we remove more carbon than we emit. So the science is clear on where we need to be, and getting there will require contributions from all sectors. This means reducing emissions throughout the economy and converting emission sources to sinks where possible. Global temperatures will continue to rise without efforts to reduce emissions. The IPCC special report evaluates differences between limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C. In general, limiting warming to just 1.5 degrees C reduces climate-related risks and increases flexibility in mitigation and adaptation options. California has identified many climate change impacts, such as rising sea levels, increased frequency and intensity of heat waves and wildfires, increased drought, and reduced snowpack. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C could slow the rate of sea level rise compared to a global temperature increase of 2 degrees C. Risk to water supply and food security associated with drought and reduced snowpack could be lessened. Risk to human security and health associated with wildfires and heat waves would be reduced if global temperatures stabilized at 1.5 degrees C. California is investing in adaptation projects to lessen the impact of climate change. The scale of needed adaptation would be reduced if the global temperature increase is limited to 1.5 degrees. Vulnerable populations are disproportionately affected by climate change, but if warming is limited to 1.5 degrees C, there's greater potential to reduce climate change-related inequities. The path to carbon neutrality requires actions on both sources and sinks. Today, we track statewide GHG emissions from transportation, electricity, commercial, residential, industrial, agriculture, and waste management sectors, including high global warming potential gases. We also track emissions and sequestration in our natural and working lands. Currently, these are a source of GHG emissions, releasing more carbon than they are sequestering. Some emissions from the sector are part of the natural cycle and are necessary for healthy systems, including emissions from periodic fires. Today, California emits GHGs from fossil energy and industrial sectors, as well as from our natural and working lands. To achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century, we must minimize emissions from our fossil energy and industrial sources and transition our natural and working lands from a source to a sink, such that we achieve net negative greenhouse gas emissions. As we start to consider the concept of carbon neutrality, our starting point is CARB's existing accounting framework, which includes all major greenhouse gas emissions and not just carbon dioxide. CARB's 2017 scoping plan established a strategy to achieve the state's GHG emissions targets. The programs implemented to date put us on track toward the 2030 target, but we must diligently monitor and adjust scoping plan measures to assure we achieve the 2030 target. In addition, the scoping plan identified potential actions that could enhance the strategy and put the state on a trajectory of continued GHG emissions reductions beyond 2030. These actions may not have been included in the specific scoping plan strategy due to costs, need for additional research, or technical feasibility. However, these actions were included in the broader scoping plan as they have the potential to reduce GHGs and provide co-benefits such as safer drinking water and cleaner air. In 2019, CARB staff is initiating dialogue and gathering information to assess the potential actions identified in the scoping plan, as well as additional opportunities to achieve carbon neutrality. We're holding a series of workshops to provide a forum to explore topics focused on sequestration activities, energy demand and supply, and transformation across economic sectors. Last year, we held 2 workshops focused on transportation, and this year we're expanding to look at all sectors. Today, we're looking at the industrial sector. In addition, we continue to work with other agencies, academics, and international partners. Our state and local partners have expertise and authority that are critical in helping the state reduce GHGs. We also want to leverage external resources. We have an opportunity to engage with academics and researchers who may already be evaluating some of the actions in the broader scoping plan, and these discussions can help inform the research agendas. International partners are facing similar challenges and considering similar options. For example, California is working with the EU to identify pathways for industry to transition away from fossil fuels toward low carbon intensity products and processes. The path forward for addressing climate change must include both reducing emissions and sequestration. This must happen globally to avoid the most adverse impacts of climate change. We're taking this opportunity to start engaging on what it will take to achieve carbon neutrality here in California, and this can help inform what must be scaled up and implemented elsewhere. This pie chart breaks down California's 2016 carbon emissions into major economic source sectors. Transportation is the largest source of emissions. The industrial sector, our focus today, contribute about 23% of total emissions. Other major sectors include electricity generation, electricity imports, agriculture, and commercial and residential activities. But again, achieving statewide carbon neutrality is going to require contributions from every sector. This chart shows trends in California GDP, population, and emissions from 2000 to 2016. At the top in green is GDP, where we see strong economic growth interrupted by the recession around 2009. In blue, California's population, and therefore its demand for goods and services, continues to grow steadily each year. Despite the growth in GDP and population, statewide emissions have been decreasing since 2009. Emissions per capita and emissions per GDP are declining at an even steeper rate. These emission trends must continue and accelerate to ensure statewide emissions and carbon neutrality goals are met. And this pie chart focuses on the 2016 cap and trade program covered emissions from the industrial sector. We see that the majority of covered emissions from the petroleum refining and oil and gas come from the petroleum refining and oil and gas production. California has a broad and diverse industrial sector that also includes cement manufacturing, metals processing, food processing, mineral mining, paper production, glass production, and chemical manufacturing, among others. California has the largest manufacturing output of any US state. Industrial firms account for over 9% of private employment in California, and manufacturing generates about 10% of the gross state product. Changes in the industrial sector correlate strongly with changes in the overall economy. As the population and economy grow, so must production grow to meet both demand from within and from outside the state. This can bring increased availability of industrial jobs and potentially emissions. For example, growth in housing and construction usually increases demand for building materials like cement, glass, and gypsum. The rate of economic growth is an important determinant for industrial emissions. Despite recent strong growth applying upward pressure on emissions, California's industrial emissions have stayed relatively flat year to year, with a slight decrease since 2014. California is a leader in manufacturing and industrial efficiency, and the efficiency of our industry continues to improve at rates faster than the national average. Improving efficiency allows economic activity to increase without corresponding increases in GHG emissions. So the suite of measures we have laid out in the scoping plan are appropriate and working, but long-term carbon neutrality is going to require additional actions. Moving toward a cleaner economy and ensuring carbon neutrality requires us to take deeper GHG reductions in this sector. We have Board Resolution 1746, directing CARB staff to continue to evaluate and explore opportunities to achieve significant cuts in GHG emissions from all sectors. Today, we're looking at the industrial sector and achieving our long-term goals, and CARB will continue holding a series of public meetings this year to explore a variety of topics in the context of carbon neutrality. Over the past decade, CARB has adopted and implemented a suite of measures that are working to reduce industrial sector GHG emissions in California. Cap and trade regulation, LCFS regulation, oil and gas regulation, and the regulation for energy efficiency and co-benefits assessment of large industrial sources are the key measures that cover this sector. And while we continue to seek further GHG reductions, it's important to recognize the state has a long history of addressing health-based air pollutants in the sectors as well. California's air quality programs are responsible for significant public health improvements through statewide and regional air quality planning requirements, advancement of technology-based solutions, and risk reduction efforts near industrial facilities. However, certain communities continue to experience environmental and health inequities from air pollution. CARB is in the process of implementing AB 617 through the Community Air Protection Program, which provides a new community-focused action framework to reduce air pollution and improve public health in communities most impacted by air pollution. There are also incentive mechanisms in place to encourage industrial GHG reductions. The Cap and Trade program is designed for compliance flexibility to minimize costs, and there is also free allowance allocation for industrial facilities to minimize leakage. Relocation of industrial production would shift GHG emissions outside of the state without the benefit of reducing GHGs that contribute to global impacts. Emissions leakage can also mean jobs leakage. CARB implements a product-based allowance allocation method that scales with output to incentivize efficient in-state production. Cap and Trade program allowance auctions raise proceeds that are reinvested in projects that reduce GHGs and further the goals of AB 32 through the California Climate Investments. These proceeds are currently funding the Food Processor Investment Program, which is providing grants, loans, and financial incentives to food processors to implement projects that reduce GHG emissions. In addition, there are utility incentive programs aimed at reducing industrial GHG emissions, such as financing for equipment upgrades, energy efficiency programs, and custom rebates. Wrapping up, this slide identifies some of the resources and reports discussed in this overview. Again, we're going to have 2 sessions with panelists from a range of fields presenting on and discussing the economic considerations and the potential technologies for achieving deeper GHG reductions in the industrial sector. Derek Nixon is CARB staff in the Cap and Trade program. He'll moderate the first session on economic considerations of industrial emissions reductions with the panelists that we currently have seated up front. And I invite Derek to start the first session.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So as Mark said, we already have the 4 panelists up front. And thanks again, panelists, for being here. Each panelist will give a 10 to 12-minute presentation, and then after their presentations, we'll have a discussion among the panelists, and then follow up with opening up for question and answer from the audience for the panelists. So first up, we'll have Meredith Fowley. Meredith Fowley is an associate professor with the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley. And then after Meredith, I'll just go down the line. So Mix Kvarla is a government relations advisor at the Gualco Group, and he's here on behalf of the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance. His presentation will be followed by Rebecca Dell, and she is an industrial strategist at the Climate Works Foundation. And then finally, Chad White is a program lead for the Climate Tech Finance Group at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So we're very excited to have all of you here, and Meredith, take it away.
Great, this is on. Excellent. So thanks, Derek, and thanks for the invitation. I appreciate being a part of this discussion. And just as Derek mentioned, I'm an economist at UC Berkeley. I've spent a bunch of time thinking about the impacts of environmental regulation on industry, but I want to acknowledge that those of us who work with data are restricted to looking backwards, to looking to see what past policies and past price changes seem to be doing in terms of changing industrial outcomes that we're concerned about, from trade flows to jobs to innovation. And so I want to acknowledge that what we're talking about today could be construed as uncharted territory. So what I'm going to spend my time talking about is summarizing what I think we've learned from this sort of backward-looking analysis of how environmental regulations have impacted industry, and talk a little bit, as Mark has already talked about, and many of you are familiar with, what California is doing currently to try and strike a balance between incentivizing emissions reductions here in California, mitigating unintended impacts on industry. Also acknowledge what I think everyone's aware of. I was just in Europe last week. The world is watching. There's a lot of interest in what California is doing here to try and negotiate this difficult balance. And then I'm going to turn it over to my fellow panelists for a more forward-looking discussion of challenges, opportunities, and solutions. Okay, so the fact that we're all here today underscores the fact that this concept of carbon neutrality is really gaining importance and momentum. And just 10 years ago, the idea of a carbon neutral power sector seemed aspirational, but now with falling battery storage costs and falling renewable technology costs, California's commitment to 100% zero carbon electricity seems within reach by 2045. But as we all know, last year the carbon neutrality stakes were raised even higher when then Governor Jerry Brown pledged to go completely carbon neutral. And this covers all the state's emissions. So these executive orders are not non-binding, but they can chart a course and guide efforts. And so I think given the threats posed by global climate change, carbon neutrality is an important long-range global goal. But I also want to acknowledge, at least I need my own opinion, is a narrow focus on achieving carbon neutrality in California can risk failing to account for the big picture and cause us to overlook more meaningful global solutions. So a jumping off point for my comments today is to state the obvious: California's industrial producers compete in a global economy. So a narrow focus on driving California's emissions to zero could have unintended consequences that we just need to be mindful of. Okay, so this is a map that many of you have probably seen before. This is just summarizing the status of carbon pricing globally. And I think the good news is that now we've hit a milestone of 20% of global emissions subject to some sort of existing or planned carbon pricing regime, but that does leave 80% uncovered. And so this incomplete nature of existing carbon pricing programs, they're covering only a subset of the sources that are contributing to the problem, raises some really vexing challenges, and raises the possibility that emissions reductions achieved here in California will be offset by a shift in production and associated emissions abroad. And so the concern, of course, is that the policy-induced increase in operating costs here in California could cause California's producers to lose market share to out-of-state rivals who don't face the same costs or obligations. And so this can shift production and associated emissions outside. So we economists like to give sort of odd names to sort of terminology to these kinds of problems. We talk a lot about leakage. So at least in my world, emissions leakage refers specifically to an increase in emissions outside of California that's caused directly by California's climate change policy that's increasing the operating costs here in the state. We can also, of course, worry about rent leakage, the shift of rents outside that is induced by this asymmetry in regulation. So I also wanted to note we have lots of different types of leakage when we think about this problem. So what I've just talked about, the story I just told, is more about trade and trade flows changing in response to changing relative operating and production costs. The other concern we might have, this is certainly a concern in Europe, is that if a large open economy reduces its demand for carbon-intensive inputs, that can change global prices. It can drop the prices of those carbon-intensive inputs and then stimulate demand in other economies. Lest I depress you too much, there's also a positive story one can tell in terms of negative leakage. So if we induce innovation here in California and we drive down the cost of low-carbon technologies and make it more affordable for our less or unregulated rivals to adopt those clean technologies, that's the negative leakage. You can actually reduce emissions outside of California with your California-specific policies. Okay, so I wanted to just hundreds of studies, probably too many studies by some estimation, have been trying to unpack the impact of these regulatory asymmetries. This idea that one jurisdiction imposes a costly regulation, other jurisdictions don't impose symmetric regulation. What happens to a whole array of industrial outcomes, from employment to investment to trade flows? So I'm not going to pick through all these. I only have 10 to 12 minutes. I'm happy to provide studies if people are interested, but just lots of work poring over sometimes firm or facility level data, trying to understand what happens when you sort of shock one part of the economy with a compliance cost that others are not subject to. And again, summarizing in 2 slides, literally thousands of pages of economic papers and research, I think these are the basic findings that are coming out of this literature that's getting increasingly rich and increasingly sort of specific with the microdata that researchers are gaining access to. I think it's fair to say that across pretty much most studies I've seen, these asymmetries in environmental regulation, so my costs rise and your costs don't, can lead to statistically significant adverse impacts on trade, employment, plant location, and productivity in the short run. But it's important to stress that the scale of these impacts, these estimated impacts, are quite small relative to other factors that determine trade flows and investment and innovation and jobs. And these are factors like proximity to demand centers, agglomeration, local labor market conditions, et cetera. It's also important to stress that these effects tend to be concentrated in a fairly small subset of sectors, typically sectors where energy costs are significant, although there's some exceptions to that rule. And what that means is that for those sectors, leakage and competitiveness impacts represent a genuine risk, and we really should be targeting compensation and policy features to mitigate the impacts on those sectors. And so that raises the question of what should we be doing, and this is not the focus of, specific focus of this session, but I did want to just say a little bit about what California already is doing, and sort of how economists view the trade-offs inherent in this approach. So the basic idea, as Mark mentioned, is we have kind of a carrot and stick approach where if you're a producer, you need to purchase permits to offset your emissions, but for every unit of output you produce in California, you receive a free allocation. And the key here is that you are penalizing, you're taxing the harmful emissions, but you're incentivizing the production and trying to sort of offset leakage to the extent that it would occur. And I think the good news is there's lots of papers and research that has been conducted to drive home the point, and it's quite intuitive, that this kind of output-based subsidy can really mitigate emissions leakage. This is just a graph from a study we did of the cement sector that really drove home the significant extent to which this kind of leakage updating can mitigate the extent to which you increase emissions outside your jurisdiction as a consequence of the incomplete policy you're implementing. But it's also important to stress that there are side effects to this output-based updating, right? So on the one hand, it's going to dilute the carbon price signal that consumers see. So if you're hoping that consumers are going to substitute away from more carbon-intensive products to less, that output-based updating is going to dilute that signal and reduce the extent to which that substitution occurs. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you're subsidizing some sectors and you're subject to a binding cap, that's going to reallocate the abatement that has to happen to other sectors that are getting smaller or no subsidies. Put differently, you're increasing the abatement costs you need to incur at home to meet that cap. So this is to say that output-based updating is a very powerful tool for mitigating leakage, but there are real efficiency and distributional implications. And what that says to me is we just need to be judicious in targeting these subsidies at the industries where leakage risk is highest. So I'm not going to go through this formula, I think, for this audience. I guess what I want to say is, intuitively, how should we be thinking about these subsidies? You want to subsidize output according to the emissions outside of California it crowds out. Or put differently, when you reduce production at home, if a significant of that production shifts abroad, along with associated emissions, then a larger subsidy is warranted on the basis of leakage risk. And I think the point is, and we've got a paper coming out that will articulate or elucidate this, I think what California is doing is very close to what I think we should be doing in terms of thinking about striking that balance between taxing emissions or incorporating the cost of emissions here at home and subsidizing industry to really mitigate the leakage risk. But I think that there are refinements that can be made. So I think in conclusion, I see the potential, based on the work that I've done and others, I think the potential for leakage is significant in some emissions intensive sectors, and I think that's particularly important to keep in mind as we're increasing our ambition when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions here in California. I want to underscore the point that the kind of policy features we're implementing to mitigate leakage come at a cost, right? We're redistributing the burden of abatement costs, and we're diluting the price signal that we need to be sending consumers so that they can change their consumption and move it towards less carbon-intensive inputs. So we need that signal, and so we need to think that that's a cost of the subsidies we're using. The analysis that we've done here is in the spirit of trying to refine California's approach, and so I think that there's more refinements to be made. But I guess getting back to that negative leakage point, I think that it's quite possible that the kinds of policy features we're currently using to mitigate leakage concerns probably need to be coupled with incentives to stimulate the innovation that we will so desperately need. if industry is going to be part of the carbon neutrality objectives, while also remaining a vital part of California. So I will stop there and turn it over to my fellow speakers to talk more about forward-looking challenges and policy approaches.
Thank you, Meredith. Up next is Mick.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to present today. As mentioned before, I'm here on behalf of the California Council for Environmental Economic Balance, which is a business labor organization, trying to seek that balance in the economy between environmental policy and our ability to maintain jobs. Kind of want to caveat, just as this proceeding's very preliminary and our thinking's also in the early stages, and anything that I might say that might be offensive was probably my fault. Anything that you guys like is probably from our membership. So, slide. Okay, at this point, I think ARB is on the right track with looking at sources versus sinks, or sources equaling sinks as kind of the end goal for 2045. I've included the kind of the preliminary definition that SEEB is using to how we're going to formulate our policy positions on carbon neutrality going forward. It's important to note that economics are going to be a big driving factor in how the public policy in and around carbon neutrality comes out. It's obvious that the business cycles have impacts on public policy, and to that end, it's the kind of interface between politics and the economics of the day that are going to determine, how heavily we rely on source mitigation and direct reductions versus, the opportunity for new carbon sinks and the use of offsets. And so all that is to say is that both the legislature and the public tend to vote for economics. What's happening today with my budget personally at my household really drives a lot of the public debate and discourse. So to that end, every jurisdiction, at least as far as we're kind of looking at in their climate change policy, has some sort of form of domestic product protections. Be it through the forms of border adjustments or incentives through output-based benchmarking. All of this is to protect the jobs and kind of the domestic effects that going as far as we've gone already and setting goals like SB 32 and then having discussions about mid-century goals of carbon neutrality by 2045. To that end, California is part of a global marketplace, and the competitiveness of our industries is based in and around, one, the proximity of the markets that we're selling goods to or producing goods for, but also, how that interfaces with the international policy of the day. And as Meredith highlighted, there's only 20% of jurisdictions, 21% of the jurisdictions that are currently facing climate policies. Not many are as rigorous as California's, though some have appropriate carbon pricing, and I think that's a good first step for a larger entry. As we look at the national policy, right now there's kind of lack of a comprehensive national approach, but I think as we talk about carbon neutrality and 2045, the 45Q tax credits are going to be increasingly important, especially as California formulates its policy. With California cap and trade and the 45Q tax credits over the span of the next 26 years, there'll be a point where there is a business case for businesses to invest heavily in carbon sequestration and sinks. And to the extent that we can continue that at the national level, absent some sort of national carbon pricing policy or something like that, I think we should encourage the Fed to keep going in that direction. And then we have regional policy. California's, I think I was in the Schwarzenegger administration back when we started doing WCI work, and we haven't really seen that evolve into what I think everyone was hoping for. So regionally, we've seen discussions up north with Oregon and Washington to create a broad-based carbon pricing thing. There's some stuff in the energy sectors, but we're lacking kind of that same kind of climate leadership on the industrial sectors that we've seen here in California. And to that end, there is pressure from states that aren't even having this discussions, like Arizona and Nevada, for certain types of industry. And to that end, I think California's done a decent job with the design of our cap and trade program to protect those industries. But again, as we look really far into the future, to the mid-century goal, we're going to have to readjust that thinking, because this is a substantially bigger stretch than achieving the 20% reduction for AB 32, the additional reductions by 2030, and then going forward. So to that end, California's state policy is fairly big. It covers most of the sectors at this point that are the big contributors of emissions. And to that end, we've struck the balance between the scoping plan and the carbon pricing. While seen in the cap and trade and LCFS and RPS, there's a number of other policies, both within the climate program and outside the climate program, that add environmental mitigation pressures to these industries. And to a certain extent, we've found kind of a sweet spot with this economy at this point in time and those regulations. However, as we start to design for the future, there's going to have to be certain things put back on the table that we may have taken off the table to get to a 2020 goal, to encourage certain behaviors. Same with the 2030 goal. We've taken certain policies off the table. We've taken certain technologies off the table that, as we look farther forward, with the ultimate goal being zero, it might be worth putting those technologies back on the table to help build some infrastructure for the future. So predicting the future, I think, is the most difficult part about this. We don't know the technology. We don't know the economic environment. The business cycle is it's getting longer over time. I think most economists agree that the severity of the business cycles have kind of waned a bit. But we have to account for that while we're designing policies such as a carbon neutrality by 2045. Economics we can see the signs, and we can kind of guess that maybe we're in a late phase right now of growth, and things are moderating, but we don't know what's going to come, when the economy contracts or if there's potentially recession. And we don't want to design a policy that in those moments, in those economic times, that there are big calls for regulatory easing, or that we have to abandon our goal in order to adjust for the politics of that day. And so I think to that end, we've done a decent job designing this program coming out of the last recession and working for this moment where we've had expansion. But we need to be aware of what's coming down, and that we know things are going to slow at some point, and how we're going to impact that with the policy is important to consider. So to that end, I think at this point, we're a generation out from the end goal, so we need to have an everything and approach. All solutions from all sectors should be on the table and reconsidered if there are real emission reductions to be achieved. I don't think we have the benefit of choosing, I want this because it's more pure, or I want this because I want to preference those outcomes. I think we need all the outcomes. If it reduces a ton of carbon, it reduces a ton of carbon, and it should be included in our policy. To that end, I think there's going to need to be a big conversation around carbon capture and sequestration at industrial facilities. While there's controversy around some of the products produced by these facilities, I think the jobs count for themselves. These are high quality, mostly union, high wage jobs, and they support a robust middle class. And without these manufacturing jobs, I think it's unforeseeable for how California's class structure mitigates. We're seeing kind of the higher end wages getting stratifying with the lower end wages, and we don't want to create a white collar versus service industry. We want to have a robust middle class to kind of, which has a lot of impacts in terms of taxation and other policies. So to the extent that we can increase opportunities in those industrial facilities to both do the industrial sequestration through mechanical purposes, but also to the extent that we can create and expand opportunity for unions like the ones at SEEB that can do mitigation at wetlands and do forestry management and things along those lines. So prescription getting in the way of the good. I think when we've designed some of the policies for AB 32 and SB 32 in a way to drive certain amounts of innovation, and I think we've seen a lot of the investment in those places. But again, this is to further say that we can't predict the future, and to that end, we shouldn't restrict ourselves on any technologies that have ability to reduce emissions moving forward. That said, regulations do have the ability to pick winners and losers, and we need to kind of be careful about that, especially with such a stretch goal. of coming down from where we're at now to kind of a net zero. Furthermore, we're seeing through environmental policy kind of the displacement of manufacturing from the urban cores. This has led to kind of an increased cost of living near cities, and it's also driving that kind of stratification where we're having a two-track economy of the professional class and then the service class who provide services to those. And I don't necessarily know that that's the appropriate kind of economic or political economic direction for the state of California. So then the question is, will California pick winners or losers moving forward? We're seeing a drive towards electrification, which has inevitable, the counterpoint of that is the reduction of combustion. And while that's laudable for many cases, at this point in time, there's a certain amount of productive outcome that is limited with the technology we have on those things. So, and we're also abandoning some kind of the early cores of California environmental policy and energy efficiency in favor of electrification. Super boilers run by electrical are just not as efficient as natural gas burnings. And then with that move towards electrification and with the move towards 100% RPS, there's going to be a major infrastructure need for our electric grid, which comes at its own cost. So to that end, we think there are opportunities for carbon neutral and carbon negative fuels and thermal processes, as well as the use of sequestration moving forward. And so to kind of wrap things up, I think California's biggest role and biggest policy at this point has always been the leadership that we can convey by maintaining a robust industrial sector with middle-class jobs. Carbon neutrality is going to ultimately transform everything. It's so far out at this point, we can't predict what's going on or what will happen technologically or economically between now and then. And that there should be some consideration to reducing near and midterm prescriptive policies in order to open up pathways for that long-term goal. If our goal is to shoot for zero, we can't allow anything to impede that pathway. It's such a long stretch. And so then I just threw in a quote, and this is from Kennedy's moonshot speech. And I think it's particularly relevant for what we're talking about today. At that point in time, there was no kind of real thought of how we were going to do it, but they brought all industry to the table in order to achieve that ultimate outcome. So thank you.
Thanks, Mick. And now Rebecca.
All right. Thank you all very much for coming. And thank you to CARB, and particularly Derek and Mark, for organizing this great event. So they asked me to speak a little bit about the role of civil society in all of this. And I want to start by putting that in the context of global industrial emissions and because I think that that's very important for understanding where California can have the biggest impact, particularly given, as Meredith pointed out, the significant national and international trade of industrial products. So if we look globally, so this big rectangle represents all of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, all gases, all sources, all countries. It's about 50 gigatons a year at this point. And industrial emissions are a third of that. So that's that upper left-hand corner box in gray. Those are direct industrial emissions. And then that gray-blue box is the electricity and heat that's used by industrial facilities. So we're talking about really one of the largest sources of emissions in the world, one of the biggest pieces of the climate problem. Moreover, if we look historically, so here is the same breakdown by sector, and you can see, and the direct industrial emissions and the electricity that is used by industry are at the top. And the thing I really want to draw your attention to is that the slope of the line at the bottom of that industry wedge is much shallower than the slope of the line at the top of the industry wedge. And that's because industrial emissions are not only a third of global emissions, but they're rising twice as fast as overall global emissions. So this is a really acute problem. Now, when we look in the state of California, the situation looks a little different. So, and just to, I forgot about this slide. And it's also worth noting that these emissions are heavily concentrated in a relatively small number of sectors. Cement, steel, and chemicals are the big ones. Aluminum and pulp and paper are also significant. In that other wedge goes all mining, all construction, all light manufacturing, all food processing, everything that happens in a factory besides these 5 heavy material processing industries. So that's really what dominates the industrial emissions landscape. Now, here in California, if we use the same methodology, so what I've done here is taken California's emissions and allocated them to sectors using the same methodology as I did for the global emissions. And the industrial sector is much smaller. It's about 1/7. If we use instead the sectoral allocation that CARB uses, it's 1/4, as we saw earlier. It's about 23 or 24%. The difference there is almost entirely petroleum extraction and refining. The petroleum extraction and refining is not considered an industrial activity in the international statistics, but it is considered an industrial activity here in California, and that's the source of the difference. So we're talking about, either way, a very significant portion of California's emissions. But if we look at it from the consumption perspective instead of from the emissions perspective, it actually becomes even larger. So what this is an estimate of the total greenhouse gases that are attributable to the people of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, BACMUD, including both the emissions that are generated within the district, within California, and also the emissions that are generated around the world through goods and services that the people of the Bay Area consume. And so, pardon me, you have a small number of sources of direct emissions that are things like the natural gas heaters in your home and your vehicle fuels, and then you have a large number of indirect emissions, things where you're not actually burning the fuels yourself, but the services, the goods and services you consume are leading to emissions elsewhere. Of those, I have attempted an extremely rough estimate, so don't get hung up on the details here, of which of those indirect emissions are likely to have happened in the state of California versus out of state. So in some cases, things like construction and waste processing, those are going to be in-state indirect emissions. Other things like physical goods that we consume, food that we eat, the air travel that we do, most of those emissions are going to end up being out of state. And we can see the consequence of this because they estimate that using a consumption-based accounting, your average individual in the Bay Area is the ultimate source of 16 tons of CO2 emissions per year. But if we just take the total emissions that happen domestically within the state of California, and we divide them by our population, that gives us something closer to 12 tons of CO2 per person per year. And so we have an enormous amount of influence over greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial sector, both through the industrial activities that happen in the state of California and also the consumption of industrial products that happens by Californians. Now, how we translate this into policy measures, into accounting measures, is, of course, quite complicated. The subject of consumption-based greenhouse gas accounting is, as Meredith was saying with regards to leakage, there's a vast academic literature on this subject with no consensus. There are both kind of top-down economy-wide approaches that you can take. There are also approaches where you start with individual products and you try and trace the entire supply chains, or you start at or you work at the firm level. And so that's, I think, something to that how we translate a consumption-based framework into policy is a complicated question and one that's worthy of discussion for a group like this. But I think regardless of those complexities, the fact of the matter is that the state of California has potentially an enormous both responsibility and opportunity to influence an the industrial transformation more broadly by thinking not just about our production, but also about our consumption. And I think when we talk about emissions reductions from the industrial sector, I usually divide them into these three big buckets. So this equation, don't be alarmed, it's a very simple one, and it is true by definition. So our total greenhouse gases, that's the GHG, is from the industrial sector, is going to be the product of all of the services we consume. So that's the end of the line stuff that we actually want. That's things like housing and illumination and mobility and washing and entertainment. So the services multiplied by the amount of products that we need to deliver a service, multiplied by the amount of material that we need to make a product, multiplied by the amount of emissions that are generated to make a material. And one of the reasons that I have been emphasizing the importance of thinking not just about consumption, but also about, not just about production, but also about consumption, is that when we think about production only, then we really end up only looking at that last figure in the equation, the emissions intensity. So we end up thinking only about what we can do at the level of the industrial facility, when in fact we have an enormous number of options throughout the rest of the economy. Many of those options are lower cost and higher leverage than the options that are focused on the industrial facility that have to do with making our economy more efficient in the way that we use products and also in the way that we use materials. Pardon me. So to give you a couple of examples of how this might work in actual policy practice, there are some things that we're already starting to do in California and that we're thinking about doing in the future. So among the demand side options, so we can go out and we can make markets for low carbon materials. One of the ways we can do that is through public procurement. Here in California, we already have the Buy Clean California law, AB 262, which says that for state purchasing, for public purchasing by the state of California, for most of their building materials, the state is supposed to buy building materials that have lower than average emissions in the manufacture of those building materials. That law was passed in 2017, and it's still in the enabling regulations for its implementation are still under development, but that's an example of something we can do on the demand side, and that applies to facilities in the state of California, but also to facilities that are outside of the state of California but participating in the California market. We can also just do some basic accounting about what are the embodied emissions. In buildings in California, already today, it's probably between 1/3 and 1/2 of all of the emissions that are produced by a building over its entire lifetime are associated with making the building materials and not with the energy use when you are doing activities, living, working, whatever, inside of the building. And yet, we have been very aggressive at regulating the energy use in the building sector. We have not yet attempted to even do, as I said, basic accounting on what are on how much emissions are associated with those building materials. We also have options around material substitution using low clinker cements and using timber. And we also have options around improving the quality and quantity of secondary materials. Right now, the most recycled materials are of dramatically lower quality than the associated primary materials that they're recycled from. That's not inevitable in most cases, but there are interventions that would be required to facilitate reuse or high quality recycling. And then, of course, we have here in California, we have an enormous set of resources around research, science, technology, and so we can also be leaders in developing low emissions intensity, future low carbon industrial facilities. Now, if all of this is starting to sound kind of expensive, I want to reassure you that it's in fact much, much cheaper than you're probably assuming. So what I've put up here are a couple of tables. So the first table shows if you, some basic materials like steel, cement, and ethylene, how much they cost, how much is a typical emissions associated with making those materials, and then if we were to add $100 per ton price, some kind of regulation or tax or pricing or anything that cost $100 a ton of greenhouse gas emissions, how much is that going to increase the cost of those materials? Well, the increase in the cost of those materials can be dramatic. $100 per ton of CO2 might increase the cost of a ton of steel by 50%. It might double the cost of a ton of cement. So that feels like a really scary number. But these materials tend to represent an extremely small portion of the cost of finished goods. So I'm going to give you just one example, which is the bridge. So there's a particular bridge that I had in mind when I made this table, which is the east span of the Bay Bridge. I live in Oakland. This bridge looms large in my imagination, also in my bay. This bridge cost $6.5 billion. However, the total cement bill for this bridge, which is basically made out of cement, was, according to my best estimate, about $20 million. So $6.5 billion for a bridge, $20 million for the cement. And so that's a rounding error. And the compliance costs associated with reducing emissions on that cement are also going to be a rounding error on the cost of the finished bridge. And so we should think about this not as a problem of can we afford low carbon materials, can we afford a low carbon industry, but more how do we make sure that the costs are efficiently passed through to the final consumer. This is very closely related to the work that Meredith was describing a moment ago. Finally, the civil society organizations, like the one I work for, can play a bunch of important roles in this discussion. There are traditional civil society roles like information, awareness, and communications. We here in California are fantastic in our level of awareness and activity around energy efficiency. We have not yet, and that's mostly through the campaigning efforts of some really important civil society organizations that started that off in the 1970s. But we have no similar level of awareness around the opportunities to fight climate change with material efficiency in addition to energy efficiency. We also, things like training workforces and then also knowledge development and policy advocacy roles are, again, things that civil society can contribute to this broader effort by the state. In conclusion, I feel very confident that California can be a world leader in decarbonizing the industrial sector. This is going to require a comprehensive approach that looks both at the direct emissions from industrial facilities, but also the embodied emissions in our consumption. And we're going to have to figure out an effective way to balance those two frameworks in our thinking and in our policy making. And it's going to require all of the stakeholders that are represented in this room and around the state to make this effort a success. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rebecca. And finally, we'll have Chad give his presentation, and then we'll start a panelist discussion. So, Chad.
The Bay Area Air Quality Management District has developed a new incentive program to decarbonize industrial emissions in the Bay Area. It's called Climate Tech Finance. It's climate because the focus is reducing greenhouse gas emissions or increasing sequestration. It's tech because it's focused on new or upgraded infrastructure, and it's finance because it's incentive, and in this case, debt financing, but as I'll explain in some ways is the point of the conversation, it's combined with matchmaking. I guess just to link myself to the other presentations quickly, I'm trying to be more forward-looking, I guess. We're talking about tech deployment here. We're trying to put new things on the table, so that's a nod to Nick, and we're talking about production-based emissions in the Bay Area, which is a nod to Rebecca. And this is probably in some respects a case example from a public sector agency that's trying to move into this kind of endeavor. And what I'm going to try to offer is a nominal case insight for a program that's really just getting started. So in addition to introducing the program and in some ways making a bid for partners and participants, I want to use my time to encourage attention to a kind of dimension of economic innovation. And that's that industrial decision-making can be bureaucratically and temporally distributed among a number of people. This distributed decision-making is often more complicated, and successfully incentivizing innovations when you have this kind of organizational context can mean more than just trying to target emissions in a general sense. It can mean bridging them within the organization. So the leitmotif here is that technology innovation involves some kind of behavioral change, which can also involve some kind of organizational change or bureaucratic alignment. And the two main points that I want to make as we get towards the end is that to show how greenhouse gas design improvements and incentives can relate to the process or the timing of decision making, and why a partnership approach we think might be a good way for us to go, at least in this initial phase. Okay, in some ways to make this point, I want to offer this cartoon. I look at myself a bit as the man in the buggy, and I look at the people I'm trying to work with and motivate as the horse. That's the infrastructure I'm trying to decarbonize. And the point that's made by the corner store is that there's a marketplace of a variety of incentives motivating what people are doing and shaping their decarbonization choices. And so an incentive needs to be not only attractive to the taker, but workable in its decision cycles in order to influence decisions or the desired behavior. So part of my question is, how do people connect with this inducement? How do they understand it within their organizations? And what forms of cooperation are needed in order to make use of it? So my hope is to provide an example of how this, what this might look like. And I'm going to do this by giving a quick intro to the Air District, just to make sure that I've provided the appropriate context. And then talk about the barriers and gap analysis that we did to come up with the Climate Tech Finance Program, and then use a case example as sort of our beta testing of the product we're trying to use. So quick point, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is one of the 35 air districts that regulate air quality around the state. They're based on the geologic air basins. We cover most of the 9 counties in the Bay Area, and it's about just under 8 million people. We have a diverse collection of industrial sources, as Rebecca has already teed up for me. What I've attempted to show here at the top is a banner of the kinds of tools that we have in our toolkit, and I've highlighted in green technology incentivized, and that's the bucket that I'm in. And what I mean to show with this next slide, my next slide is not up there. I'm not sure that this is going to have as many slides in as I want, so I'll just make my point on this slide. Technology incentivizing is one of the tools that we're using in greenhouse gas management. We have not historically managed greenhouse gases, and our movement into trying to decarbonize the industries of the Bay Area has relied heavily on this concept of technology incentivizing in comparison to our rulemaking powers. We are developing our first set of greenhouse gas related rules, but we do not yet have any greenhouse gas rules, and we are not currently permitting facilities for greenhouse gases. So this is the space where an air district like ours has the most activity at the moment. This is a breakdown of the emission sources for the Bay Area. And the point that I want to make with this slide, which is parallel to things other people have pointed out, is that in the space of industrial emissions, it's not as obvious to us that there are readily deployable technologies to help. And this is both in the case of trying to electrify industrial sources, as well as trying to figure out how to decarbonize them. So in comparison to some of the other large sectors, electricity, transportation, buildings, we felt like there was a gap here, a technology availability gap that we were concerned about. So we've used discussions with financing agencies, technology developers, investors, and customers to try to identify the reasons for the tech gap and ways to spur innovation. The first barrier that we saw was a technology readiness to deploy. So we saw that technology was getting developed. There's been a lot of effort in California to help develop new technologies, but once they get developed, high upfront costs, variations in facilities, made things difficult for the technology developer to achieve economies of scale and get things out to the marketplace. And so effectively, technology doesn't get over the hump from demonstration to deployment quite as quickly as we might hope. The second, funding to drive commercial readiness, effectively to bridge demonstration and deployment. There is a fair amount of funding that's available to be utilized, but it's often difficult for people to know what's available and which are suitable, and limitations in eligibility shape how people look at these things. And further, we've taken the attitude that incentives aren't simply about money, but also reductions in technology risk, cheaper information, and partnerships and social learning engagements that can help accelerate technology into the marketplace. And the third then is customers, connections.
We just got the updated presentation for you.
Oh,
So-
okay. No, it's just a different slide deck, but I'm just going to work off this one.
Okay.
And third thing is challenges connecting customers to the technology. Sometimes technology developers have trouble finding the customers. Sometimes adopters face the difficulty of knowing that the technology is available, and a low tolerance for risk which can be sector dependent, can slow the rate at which people are even willing to engage in certain experiments with it. This slide I put in here, but I'm just going to very quickly make the point in the interest of overall time to say that this positioned us in a traditional pipeline of technology innovation, which is represented here by the y-axis, both in the bands at the bottom and in the graph. From the development of a technology to its deployment, somewhere between demonstration and deployment of technologies. And that's where we thought that our program might best be able to contribute to technology acceleration. So shifting from gaps and barriers to goals, our goal is to help accelerate emerging tech at the financing gap, to offer financing that helps to fill this gap, and to support technology learning using a partnership concept. We've done this by developing a debt financing instrument. And there are two versions of this. One, and this represents our first design. This is our first effort to start thinking in the space. So we developed in partnership with the California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, or IBank as listed here, a loan program for public sector agencies that can finance projects up to about $30 million at competitive, or we hope, superior financing. And we also have developed a loan guarantee program for small businesses to help them access the commercial lending industry more quickly and readily. And I'm happy to talk about the terms of both of these in more detail. I've put them on the slide, but I think it probably doesn't serve our purpose right now for me to go into those. But this is our first effort to do this. That was the first thing we did, was we developed this financing mechanism. The second thing we did was did a technology assessment of our industry. And we looked across these industries that are in the Bay Area at 188 different technologies that we thought might be useful for helping to decarbonize. This report is available on our website, the link's at the bottom here, and I will again just note that the 33 highlighted in the report helped shape our priorities for figuring out how to approach and start socializing our instrument. And the last thing We developed or are in the process of developing an ongoing matchmaking workspace. So we have a network that hosts quarterly events where we bring together technology developers and what we suspect is their user base. We've had a large marketplace we operated last year as part of the Governor's Climate Summit, and we've also been speaking at places where we get the opportunity to help bring the idea to light. So 3 components, the financing mechanism, the technology assessment, and then the network that we're trying to help launch. Okay, so as a matter of what I can call beta testing, these are 3 areas where we have been concentrating our efforts. They're things that made sense to us based on the report and with a little bit of the pragmatism of you have to start somewhere. This is what we've been doing. I thought I would dive into the wastewater treatment industry as a bit of an example of what we're starting to see and to make my point about how some of this might fit and how we're understanding how this product might work. And to ground that in a little bit of detail, I just thought I would show you a wastewater treatment plant up here. This is San Francisco's major wastewater treatment plant. And I've highlighted, it's a little hard to see on the screen, but I've highlighted areas of the plant that serve different functions. And the primary reason for doing that is just to transition to this slide, which shows some of the same areas, same color coding. It's complicated. I don't mean to walk us all the way through it, but just to suggest there are different areas of the plant doing different things that have different technologies that would be of interest for deployment. And as part of our understanding working forward, we have begun to look at and understand what these things are and talk with facilities about how they might figure them into their plant's concepts and into their design cycles. Now here's the thing that I think is probably the biggest point that I can leave with, and I think fits with a part of what Carb was asking us to do, thinking about decision context and decision cycles, business cycles for these types of decisions. In this case, it's an illustration of a business cycle for the wastewater treatment plant operation. So across the top, I have a bar that shows a generic set of years, 1 through 6, that would be involved with a redesign or an upgrade effort at a wastewater treatment plant. And underneath that, I have a couple of lines that show some of the specific activities that occur during those years, which is not really my point. It's the second bar underneath it that shows that over the course of time, as those areas are progressing, people are making various conceptual choices or technology choices about what the plant will look like, and in with those, which kind of technologies they're going to use and how much greenhouse gas it's going to reduce. And our observation is that when people get to the point of looking to finance these projects, although they have been aware of the amount of money that's going to be spent all along, the design of our program shows up very late in the cycle, where the further rightmost, as you're looking at it, green arrow is in the diagram. That we often show up when the project, or people would come and apply with us at iBank when the project is 100% designed or so-called shovel ready. What is a challenge for us then is to think about the dialogue we need to have over the course of years with a facility in order to get them at the 10%, at the 50%, at the 75 and 100% phase, to have thought about and fit with our conceptions of what greenhouse gas reduction would be and to assist them in doing that. And that's partially what our technology assessment capabilities can be useful for, but it's one of the things that's a challenge for our program at this point. I had another point, and I guess I'll make it here because my slide's not here. It was in part to go back to the cartoon I used at the beginning, which is to say that that kind of situation, one in which the so-called infrastructure horse is entering the marketplace, imagines a kind of simple interaction or simple transaction that can occur between people, such as we, the financiers, and somebody who's trying to do an upgrade, as if there's kind of a spot interaction in place. And we're finding that that doesn't necessarily work very well for this kind of effort. And so what we have instead is more of a partnership approach that we're taking, where we're expecting to be involved with people for a longer period of time and help engage and discuss technologies with them in the process of ultimately helping them finance them down the road. Let's see. So my key insights for the state as we contemplate carbon neutrality, there's work to be done here. Behavioral change and incentives are needed. But a real look at the decision context, the makers and influencers. There are people inside the plant who are making a lot of these decisions, but they're heavily influenced by the technology developers and a whole series of consultants that help them design the plant, and the cycles in which they're doing it. A lot of these things will happen, particularly in the public sector, along particular design cycles. And I didn't even show you the part of the diagram that involves the various board approvals that are necessary to do it. It's a simplified version of the picture. So making the financing work means bridging technology decisions over years and probably different bureaucratic offices. In some cases, the finance office and the plant operations are two totally separate people who will exist somewhat removed from each other at different points in the cycle. So we're recognizing that this will vary by sector and even by organization. We're looking at ways that we can not only put the product out there in the marketplace, but make sure that we're creating the appropriate bridges between technology developers and users, but also the parts of the organization that need to come together in order to make some of this work. So thank you.
Great.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one final point. I would be remiss not to take the mic back to say that. We're very interested in program participants, discussion partners. I'm happy to have conversations with people. I'm open to critics. We're trying to figure out how to get this right, and I think we're kind of in the no idea is a bad idea in terms of helping us refine what we're doing. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, all four of you. So along that last comment, just reintroducing my role here is to encourage discussion between you guys as the experts, and your comments can help inform our initial thinking on industrial reductions. So I was searching for common themes as I listened to all of your presentations, and one of the things I heard from all of you was the role California can play in reducing carbon emissions over time. So for Mick, you said there's a long lead time before this target is hit. So I thought it'd be interesting to start with kind of teeing up Chad's program as something that could be the start of getting to some of the goals that you guys have talked about. So I guess Mick, starting or teeing up for the three of you. Mick, you were talking about unlocking pathways, and so starting initially with one type of technology, and then that turns on the opportunity to go to other places. Meredith, you also talked about negative innovation, or negative leakage, and that creates positive innovation. So, and then finally, so Rebecca, you said civil society, the role that you can play. So I guess all of you, as you see these funding mechanisms from government, how do you think about coordinating government together so that you can really get the best bang for the buck out of programs like Chad's? So turn it over to you guys. They're pointing at each other.
I think for different levels of government having their interactions, it's good to create a kind of the coordinated pathway for everyone, but also the engagement with the regulated sectors, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're producing products for consumers. Consumers' choice is a big part of that, and how we engage with that. I think our processes and the ability to update those processes or decarbonize them is different for different organizations, different companies, depending on what they're making, right? There are going to be some who can truly deeply decarbonize their process. There's going to be others that they're bouncing right up against the bounds of the technology for what they're making. And so I think, kind of that continual dialogue of exploring where the innovation is going to come from, and then to the extent that when one sector starts to bounce up against that it's no longer cost effective to achieve these emission reductions, I think that's where government can start to look to incentivize or create investment or create alternative pathways for them to achieve the ultimate emission reductions that California wants to achieve without displacing workers or industries that may be providing a social benefit.
I think that you, both you and Derek, make good points about the different timelines, and I think that the critical to success will be matching approaches to timelines. So there's a set of things that we can do right away that are around operational improvements at existing facilities, shifting production to the highest performing facilities, and starting to improve recovery of secondary materials for recycling and that kind of thing. Then there's a set of things that we can do in the medium term that have to do that are things that require more substantial capital upgrades at existing facilities, where we're starting to push the boundaries on new technologies, where we're starting to redesign products for maximum recyclability and for maximum material efficiency and things like that. And then there's a set of options that are around really transformational changes, really new technologies and new processes for making the materials that we need. And so we need to get started on all of those things now, because in order to reach our economy-wide decarbonization goals by mid-century, we're going to have all of those tools available to us. But the point is that, the range of approaches have associated with them a set of kind of natural timelines that have to do with technology innovation, with capital stock turnover, with business cycles, with all of these things. And we have to be sophisticated about matching, about acknowledging that and making sure that the interventions of the government, be they regulatory or incentives or taxes or whatever, are well matched to those natural timelines.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in. I couldn't agree more with how you sort of articulated it. I don't have that much to add. I mean, I focus very much on carbon pricing, and I think the data or the empirical research is fairly clear that it has had relatively little impact on innovation. It's not that it's had none, but certainly most of the action is on the more short-run outcomes that you're thinking about. So that begs the big question as to how you allocate resources to fund those long-range transformational changes, and that tension between picking winners and keeping the field wide open to see what emerges as the winner. And unfortunately, that's a question I think economists have sort of depressingly little to say. There's lots of work going on, but it's much easier to think about how to design an efficient carbon market versus how to design a really efficient set of incentives to target the resources at the long run, long game outcomes that we're pursuing.
Can I weigh in? One of the things that I find as I'm trying to deploy this kind of program is that a lot of the questions that come back to me from people is how my program's different from other programs. And so there's a kind of literacy that the public sector needs to have about the variety of incentives that people are seeing and how they stack up and where the gaps are. That's an important part of the process too. And we've thought about that enough that we've kind of wondered, like, what kind of clearinghouse should we have, or what navigational tools should we provide, and how should we understand how we situate and motivate in the context of other programs as well. So I'm hoping that we, as public agencies, have that conversation at the staff level as well as at the organization level to make sure we can do that.
So I guess maybe another point of discussion about near-term and mid-term. So before the panel started, Mick, we were talking about kind of the lead time to retrain labor force as you prepare for new processes or clean economy. And so how can we work towards that in the context of these mechanisms that'll encourage innovative processes in near-term, mid-term, and then eventually long-term? So.
Yeah, so in the context of this conversation, there is no real short-term or middle-term kind of job training that's going to prepare us for the decisions that the government's going to make on what's going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed. Training, the Institute for the Future, I think it was a study they put out, is 85% of the jobs created between now and 2030 we haven't thought of. So, to that end, we have a relatively short lead time from apprenticeship to journeyman. It's only a couple of years. And so to the extent that management and their appropriate unions are directly engaged, several years in advance for that transition. And we're seeing that on certain issues like the transition from HFCs to, from the A1 HFCs to A2 HFCs, which are potentially flammable and things like that in the kind of the HVAC refrigeration sector. That training is going to take about 18 months to 2 years to get the crews on the ground ready for that transition to something like that. And so the incremental changes are easy to plan for and can be implemented relatively quickly. Large scope changes, I think decarbonization of California's industry is the scope of what, or the impacts of what that's going to do to California's overall economy and how we shape that. Once we set the goal, and then how we define how we're going to achieve that goal through policy will largely determine the decisions that are made by the businesses and their unions at that point in terms of what skills are going to be needed, how they're going to implement it. Are we going to train people up to start working on CCS projects on site and maintaining those industrial facilities? Or are we going to be transitioning those industrial jobs to a completely different sector? That, as I think that's kind of the push-pull there. And that's obviously the big risk and the threat that I think some unions and some industrial facilities are seeing in this conversation is, do you want me here in California anymore, or are we going to displace these jobs entirely? There's hundreds of thousands of people who are working at cap sources, largely unionized, that may or may not have jobs in the upcoming future. I mean, we have, 2 carbon-free energy facilities that at San Onofre and Diablo Canyon that will go offline. Tens of thousands of people who are associated with those facilities won't be doing what they've been doing traditionally. So how do we transition them over to, solar and wind and things like that? Potentially some of them, but a lot of them don't have that skill set, or they have a very particular skill set that probably more adept to sending them to Georgia or somewhere else where they're still embracing that technology.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, I have maybe less of a comment on the training component, but I think it's related. Like, we see a need for just a greater emphasis on technology transfer in general. And I was preparing for this, was thinking about, wouldn't it be great if we had better technology deployment centers around, which could involve a training component as well. But I think that the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is that we, particularly kind of in the context of my program, we're working on trying to upgrade infrastructure we already have, but there is tremendous potential to reduce greenhouse gases by developing entirely new economies. And one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is an emphasis on trying to imagine something else being done with all the organic materials that are around the state, whether it's forest oversupply or materials that are otherwise destined for landfill, and that there's this real potential for bioenergy development, bioresource development, carbon farming, all these other emphases. And it would seem like a tremendous opportunity exists if we really put money into that bucket and we train people around it. And that's one that, although we've started to do a little bit, it doesn't seem like we've accelerated nearly as much. And so it could be really exciting for CARB to look at just a really strong push towards economic development of a sector that will do so many of the things we want, and that could involve a substantial next generation training component along with it too. We've thought about adding training to requirements for composting facilities in the Bay Area to help manage some of the concerns we have from an air quality standpoint.
Yeah, and to that end, the biomass facilities as well as the arborists are both unionized through LIUNA. They're members of SEEB, so encourage that.
I'll add something to that, which is that I think that I'll call out one, I think, really interesting example here, which is the construction industry, which is already substantially unionized. One of the, so if, I was commenting to Meredith before the event started, that if the building that we're currently sitting in is typical of medium to large commercial buildings in the United States, then it has twice as much structural material in it as is required to comply with the very safety protective building codes that we have. Buildings routinely are enormously overbuilt, and this is because construction companies understand that the structural materials are less expensive than labor. And so if they can make things simpler or easier to build and substitute material for labor, then they do that. And so there are opportunities, I think, that would require workforce development, not just in the construction workers, but also among the architects and engineers throughout the entire construction sector. But there's an enormous opportunity here for us to reduce this overbuilding. In so doing, reduce greenhouse gases enormously, because the building materials are one of the most emissions-intensive parts of the industrial sector, and also support high-quality construction jobs in favor as a substitute for emissions-intensive materials.
So I think in residential construction, you're seeing a big move towards value engineering, which is what you're talking about. It's, as opposed to 16-inch on-center structural studs, they're on 24-inch center. I think that's pretty common at this point, especially with the larger builders. But you obviously have to have the engineers and stuff like that. But I think with commercial construction, the big differentiation is the California Earthquake Authority and some of those impacts at this point. But then we are seeing a move towards more efficient construction techniques, such as the precast stuff, which we saw at Apple and the Levi Stadium. Is that the 49er Stadium? Other than the fact that they're shipping it from, up here in Sacramento down there to build. But the fact that they're doing precast is, there's potential in that also for sequestration. There's several industrial gas companies that are doing carbon sequestration by injecting CO2 into cement, which has potential of kind of long-term permanence for captured emissions in precast construction techniques.
Yeah, so the comments I was making are much more applicable to steel and cement construction than to wood-framed construction, so are less applicable for detached single-family dwelling type construction. Just as a sort of a point of information, the products that are currently on the market for injecting CO2 into cement only reduce the CO2 content of that cement by 3 or 4%. So it's at this point that technology is valuable and worth using, but makes a relatively modest impact.
So I would be remiss in not opening it up for audience Q&A. We have some roving mics, and my wife is German, so I need to stick to a schedule. So 15 minutes for audience Q&A. See some raised hands. John.
Hi, John Costantino. The question of carbon neutrality, source equals sinks, the question or the specific variable that I don't think has been mentioned in A or B, as I think still thinking about it, but I asked the panelists, what about timing? Because economics is all about timing. If you have to grow trees, and do we start in 2030? Do we start in 2045? Is it a rolling average? I just want to know the panelists' thoughts on what carbon neutrality means as far as timing. Is it a per year thing? Is it an average, an aggregate?
So I think from our perspective, anything you build today is going to help you tomorrow. But in terms of how that works with the policy and compliance and all those things.
I will somewhat reluctantly make this comment. I think from a public sector standpoint, it's difficult for us right now to do the kind of intertemporal accounting for all of that, and a lot of our emphasis is just on trying to get the most realistic numbers we can for any given year. And I think I would just echo the same thought that the more we do now, the better. But if people are trying to figure out how to schedule things in, I think it becomes a much bigger question about how the world's going to look in 5 years.
Hi, Dan Lashoff with World Resource Institute. One want to build on the previous discussion you had, which I think was good in getting the conversation a little more concrete by focusing in on the cement sector. You saw what I did there, good. Looking at the chart on slide 10 from the overview presentation, that is by far the biggest sector outside of oil and gas, petroleum refining and production, which are being addressed in California, both directly and indirectly through the low carbon fuel standard. So focusing in on that, the question, two questions about that sector. One is, does anyone on the panel know the balance between in-state consumption and in-state production of cement, and also the balance between consumption by governments, state projects like roads and
I think Mr. Houston's right behind you and he can answer a lot of those questions.
Great. So government versus private construction, so that's the other question. My comment is, given the size of this sector, I would urge ARB to consider developing a low carbon cement standard modeled on the low carbon fuel standard. This has been, I think, in my view, one of the most important policies anywhere in the world for stimulating innovation, the way the low carbon fuel standards work. And I think a low carbon cement standard would bring similar incentives to that sector, which is the biggest one on this chart after sector.
I guess maybe a short response from Bob or initial thinking if he wants. No, he says no.
So
Okay.
I don't know what the number is specifically for California, but for the United States, it's about 50% of cement is used for public construction and 50% is used for private construction.
And, oh, go ahead. No, I mean, I was going to take it, I'm going to use your question as a plea for, to highlight a data limitation that those of us who study both the sectors and other sectors, especially with respect to potential for leakage, is we can get reasonably good data on international flows, but as a researcher, the intranational, interstate, which really matters when you're California thinking about these responses, is really hard to get. So that's really limited our ability to answer those questions and others in terms of how much of California cement consumption comes from outside and vice versa.
Hi, Nina Kapoor, Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. I'm wondering if any of the panelists have any thoughts or comments on the potential of fuel switching to decarbonize gases like renewable hydrogen and renewable natural gas. I heard some discussion of electrification, but it seems that if all of this infrastructure is already in place around the gas system at many of these industrial facilities, wondering if any of the panelists have put any thought into that or what they see the potential as being in this space.
I can talk a little bit about that. So I think that for almost all of the emissions intensive industrial processes that we rely on, there exists a analogous process that could be based on hydrogen. And so if a sufficient quantity of zero carbon hydrogen were available at a sufficient price, we could make steel and cement and almost all of the basic chemicals that we make using hydrogen-based synthesis. However, there are currently those technologies, many of those technologies exist only in laboratories. They don't yet exist at industrial scale. The very first ever hydrogen reduction facility for steel just broke ground less than a year ago. It's still under construction. So I think that there's also a question about, like with natural gas, if we are going to use hydrogen in significant quantities for these processes, then we're going to need a distribution network, a storage network, And how do we get from here to there, I think is a question that we need to think about really seriously. And there's going to be a really big role for the public sector if we decide to go that way, because none of these facilities can afford to support the whole infrastructure themselves. And so if we want to have widespread use of hydrogen-based industrial processes, then there's going to have to be a big role for the public sector in planning the infrastructure and supporting its construction.
So I guess to build on that, in the near term, obviously hydrogen transportation is a good option. It's getting a much later start than battery electric vehicles, especially, but the potential in the heavy duty, medium duty sectors is real, and the potential to transition from natural gas-based hydrogen to renewable natural gas-based hydrogen, and then still use that fueling and pipeline infrastructure for potentially electrolytic hydrogen, which right now is not at all cost effective, is real. And so you can start building keys to that long-term renewable hydrogen infrastructure today with fossil based fuel, which is substantially cheaper, but still has the zero tailpipe emissions, which is, I think, the ultimate goal with a lot of the transportation type policy, at least right now.
I'll add but quickly so we can get another question in. I think that in some ways this makes the point that we had in our assessment. There's not a lot that's here to readily deploy that helps industry in one of their biggest impacts, which is the amount of power they crave. And one of the things that we've been trying to do, and I think this reinforces as well, or at least it fits with the partnership narrative I have, is just trying to get small scale projects up and running at facilities. It's difficult, like, if I use the wastewater treatment plant sector as an example, it's difficult for them to stomach the idea of completely taking a product line they have or a byproduct line like biogas coming from anaerobic digesters and buying a technology to do something else with it, but a 5 or 10% bleed off that line is reasonable for a lot of them. And so I think the question is, can we get industrial sources to move into supporting, joint venturing, trying these different types of things at their sites so we can get over more of the innovation hump?
Okay, yeah, so time for 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So
Hopefully 2.
2.
Julia Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California, and I want to thank you all. They're really interesting, important presentations. I particularly want to thank the Air Board. I was part of a team at the Union of Concerned Scientists 20 years ago that presented the first ever report on how climate change was going to impact California. Sadly, everything that report in 1999 said would happen by the end of this century has already happened in just 20 years. And so I want to echo several of the comments that you all have made, and I think Don made, about keeping sight of short-term goals and short-term priorities while we start planning for mid-century, because we've already seen a shift in the Air Board's focus to kind of mid-century goals and losing sight on some really critical near-term opportunities. The IPCC has said we have 12 years left to prevent truly catastrophic climate change. So we can't just focus on the mid-century carbon neutrality goal. We need to do things like carbon capture and sequestration, bioenergy, other carbon negative actions to help us in the near term, and above all, reducing short-lived climate pollutants. And I really am concerned that not any of you, but other staff at this agency have kind of lost sight of the urgency of short-lived climate pollutant reduction, which is one of the few things we can do to reduce emissions in the next dozen years while we take the longer-term steps to reach carbon neutrality mid-century. So I have a couple other quick points related to that. I strongly support what Mikhail Mick said about the need to use all the tools in the toolkit. We didn't get into this climate mess with just one source of emissions or one problem, and we're not going to get out of it with one solution. We need to take advantage of every tool we can. It's going to be difficult enough. And again, I think there's too much narrowing too soon to just focus on electrification and regardless of which sources, whether or not it reduces short-lived climate pollutants. So we do really need to keep track of all the tools that can make any difference. Every tool is going to matter. This is war, and we have to act like it's war, and every incremental gain is going to matter. The last thing I want to say is several of you showed slides about where emissions are coming from in the industrial sector, and I'm assuming, but want to confirm, that none of your slides actually accounted for wildfire emissions, and particularly the wildfire emissions caused by human activity, so anthropogenic emissions that are supposed to be regulated under SB 1383. We know that in the last decade, the vast majority of the catastrophic fires have been caused by electricity infrastructure, which is anthropogenic. When is the Air Board going to start to include that in the emissions from the electricity sector, the same way that SoCalGas was held responsible for its methane leak? What's the difference, and why aren't we tracking human-caused wildfire emissions, which are one of the fastest growing sources of emissions in California? And the Air Board itself has said we can't reach our mid-century goals without reducing carbon losses from our forests and putting that forest waste to better use. So I know that's a lot of comments, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. And since we've just got 4 minutes left, I might say thank you and then just jump to the last question. So,
my name is Evan Edgar from the waste sector, and I agree with Julie on everything she said. When it comes to the waste sector, we're in every sector. We cross the recycling sector for a carbon sink. We're in the transportation sector. Today we make carbon negative fuel. We're in energy sector making out of RNG, out of bioenergy, out of biomethane. We're in the energy sector making energy out of wood chips. We're in the agricultural sector doing compost or a carbon sink. And we're doing it now. The whole waste sector today is net zero now, according to the CARB AB30 scoping plan from 2014 definition. Look it up. We're net zero now, and we're being overlooked right now by CARB. And what I heard on some people on that panel about electrification at CARB, when we need to look at all sources, what Chad said is so true, that we don't need training. We're doing it right now. We have the fleet. We have our own fleet. We have the waste that go in the landfills. We're a near-term solution that we get on the heavy-duty sector where you don't have electrification for heavy-duty trucks. You don't want hydrogen. We don't need hydrogen. We're here now. We have a war on waste, and we can make it work. So don't look past the waste sector, because we're net zero now, and we need to be carbon neutral and technology neutral. Thank you.
okay, great. And so that was short enough that I think we can squeeze in one last question behind you.
Russ Bennett, CARB. Will advanced nuclear technology be considered as a potential solution moving forward?
Do you guys have any thoughts?
I don't think California has public policy to allow that. I think we have a moratorium until something is done with the current stockpile of nuclear waste at facilities. So until that's dealt with at the policy level at the state legislature, I don't foresee that. I know that there are people out there who are saying that, that's one of the things that we're leaving on the table, right? But until there's a solution for the waste, California has a legal moratorium.
Some of the advanced nuclear technologies can solve the waste issue.
Yeah, I'd be more than willing to support any legislation that you're working on.
Okay, so.
Well, let me just, we're running a little late on time, but let me just remind everybody that we do have on our webpage an area for you to submit written comments. So anybody who feels like they might have been squeezed out, please feel free to include your written comments and submit them online, and we can incorporate those into these future discussions that we'll be having too.
Great, thank you very much.
And we'll plan on taking a break, and we'll try to reconvene at 3 p.m. sharp so that we can dive into the technology focus sector. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Oh, very nice to meet you. Thanks for your presentation.
Oh, I knew who I was. Thanks, Tim.
That was it.
I only have projects that are low on it. And I inherited
Very nicely done. Thank you so much. Your insights are always insightful. Yeah. No, that was very good. It's a very good introduction and way to start the conversation. So it's I mean, I think that it's essentially goals. This is the first workshop that we're having, so I feel like this is the opportunity to just like really grow. Oh, I agree, and it's like some people out of the woodwork that you know, like you can hear them opportunities to really revolutionize things.
I agree.
And so, both in terms of technology, but also in terms of like how we do our accounting and how we structure our policy and what we decide to care about.
I agree. Exactly. All those things as well.
Like, let's have the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. Very nice. Great presentation. Very good comments. Oh, and thank you. Very helpful.
Hi, Rebecca Tell. Very nice to meet you. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. There's also a risk of to give an example, automotive steel is generally primary steel and not recycled. There are, 5 million cars in the state of California, there's zero primary steel. So 100% of those cars were made out of steel and made outside of California. And so they have an opportunity to have an influence on that. That is part of
I get that.
I know I just changed affiliations and I don't have my card yet. Do you have a card? So I'm actually very interested in what I might have one of my old cards, but I don't think my
risks associated with it. There's no easy formula to figure out. This technology is going to take off in a lot of industries.
Yeah, TRLs are always a nice kind of tool, but
yeah, also almost entirely subjective. So
good in theory.
Nice to meet you, Perry. Eric. Jeffrey, I'm Perry Stevens. Energy Commission. I'm with the Energy Innovation. Nice to meet you. Panel together. That's right. Probably going to talk about it. Too much slide.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, are you going to stay back there or are you going to sit up front? Well, I just was going to call you out and let folks know how to find you so they can, when I have to leave, they can find you later. So you can stand up or wave your hand or whatever you want to do. This one's on.
Okay, everyone, if we can make our way to our seats and kind of wrap up the conversations, we'll be getting started in just a minute. So please settle down. All right, everybody, thanks you for rejoining. We've reconstituted our panel up on the dais for the second session here. This morning we heard from a good range of panelists from academia and industry and nonprofit sector and government. We have similar broad range of fields represented here. We're going to focus on technologies for decarbonizing the industrial sector. And David Allgood, another staff in CARB's Cap and Trade program, is going to moderate the discussion, and I'll kick it over to Dave.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second panel today on the role of industry in meeting carbon neutrality. This panel will focus on the technology side to achieve deep carbon reductions in industry. And my name is David Allgood, and I've been with CARB for the last 10 years. On the Cap and Trade program, focusing on production benchmarks in industry, as well as emissions reduction technologies. So the panel on my left, I've got Jeff Risman in the industry program. He's a industry program director and head of modeling at Energy Innovation. Jeff leads development of the Energy Policy Simulator, a computer model quantifying costs and emissions impacts of policies and technologies throughout the economy. We also have Tom Mulhart, who has been the environmental supervisor for Campbell Soup Company's tomato processing operations since 2011, in addition to duties maintaining compliance costs, compliance with federal, state, and local regulations. Tom has also managed efforts to improve energy efficiency and sustainability of tomato processing operations, and he's overseen a number of efforts to reduce natural gas, electricity, and water. Perry Stevens is the principal technical leader at the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, and he's responsible for the evaluation, development, and implementation of electrification end-use technologies with utility members in their service territories. He assists member utilities to pursue programs on implementations of residential, commercial, and industrial customer segments. And Eric Stokes heads up the Energy Development and Market Facilitations Office at the Energy Commission, where he and his team oversee programs and activities to foster clean energy entrepreneurship across the state, increases the capacity of business and industries to adopt new energy technologies, and to ensure vulnerable communities are able to participate and benefit in the clean tech economy. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jeff, to start on your presentation.
Thank you so much, David, and to all the staff here for having us. So without further ado, I will get started talking about some of the technologies that we can use to help bring industrial emissions down to carbon neutral. So to begin, I'm just showing this overview slide showing California emissions in context. This will look a little familiar, the data in it, to some of the people who were here earlier. Here we're grouping the electricity used by different sectors with those sectors, kind of as Rebecca did with industry in her diagrams. When you group that in, you get about 27% of California's emissions in 2017 were from industry sector, and that share is projected to rise as things like vehicle electrification and drive down transportation emissions, whereas industry can be trickier. So 27%, and in a business as usual future, it would grow. We'll see what technologies can address that. So this is a much more detailed breakdown of emissions by industry. This particular chart is global, not California. The previous slide was California. This shows the top emitting industries, breaking down more industries than is typically seen in these diagrams. It also shows direct energy-related emissions, that's fuel combustion, CO2 process emissions, that's things like the CO2 from the breakdown of limestone to make cement, non-CO2 process emissions, methane, F-gases, and then the indirect energy-related emissions, like those associated with the production of electricity that's purchased and used by industry. In California, these three in the box are the three highest emitting industries. Iron and steel, though it's the biggest globally, is not as big as these in California. And together, these three are 80%, with the asterisk that by refining in California, that figure is the entire supply industry, so it's extraction and production, distribution and refining. So the 80% inside three broadly defined industries in state. So I'll talk now about technologies specific to certain industries, starting with one of those three, the cement and concrete industry. Cement is a binder used in concrete, and its emissions actually come from two different steps in the process, or two different types. 30 to 40% is for burning fuels for heat. In California, that's mostly natural gas. Elsewhere, it's sometimes coal. And that's to melt the input materials. Then the rest, most of the rest, is process emissions. That's breaking down limestone or calcium carbonate to make clinker, the main ingredient in cement. There's also a minor contribution from electricity use. That's mostly for grinding. So what can we do to address this using technology? Well, I'll divide it into a couple sections. First is energy efficiency, that 30 to 40%. So if the input materials are wet, then some of the energy that needs to go into it has to evaporate out that water before it can raise the temperature up. So if you use a precalciner or multi-stage heater that can use waste heat to dry the input materials, that saves energy. You can also do other steps. You reduce the maximum temperature. You can operate with oxygen-enriched air that reaches higher temperatures, and use a grate cooler, which is better at recovering heat. I'm going to keep moving fast because there's a lot of great technologies to get through. So we talked about that 60 to 7% are process emissions from limestone breakdown. So there are a few ways to address that. You can substitute other materials for clinker to up to a certain percentage while the cement retains its structural integrity. You can try, there are certain companies exploring novel cement chemistries that produce much less CO2 per quantity of cement. And then, of course, there's carbon capture, which you can apply to the process emissions, which can be a fairly pure CO2 stream. Therefore, it may be easier to capture the CO2 than from a combustion exhaust stream. There's also material efficiency, which is sometimes overlooked, which is using less to get the same service, the same building, the same value out of it. So if you can make the concrete stronger, you don't need as much to have the same strength. If it lasts longer, you don't need to replace the building as quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit more about material efficiency later. I'm going to move on to the chemicals industry at this point, another important one, and this is also subdivided into a few groups. F gases refers to fluorinated gases. They're gases with a high global warming potential. That is, they're more powerful than CO2 at trapping heat. They often are long-lived as well, which means they stay in the atmosphere for many years after being emitted. They're used as refrigerants and propellants and so forth. The main way to deal with these is to try to replace them with gases that are not, that are more climate friendly, that can do similar roles. Then there's a lot of other chemicals that are not F gases, all kinds of things that the chemicals industry produces that we use in our daily lives. A lot of the emissions for those are driven by fuel combustion because many of the reactions require energy as an input to form the complex molecules. I'll point out that hydrogen is one of those starting reactants that is used in production of many chemicals, including ammonia. So, what are some technologies? Well, in the chemicals industry, you can look at new catalysts and chemical pathways. A catalyst lowers the activation energy needed to get one chemical to change into another or to drive a reaction forward. There are also techniques that can perhaps produce hydrogen more with lower emissions and lower energy use. Methane pyrolysis is one that's still in the sort of research and development phase. And then there's electrification. So electricity can provide heat to drive many reactions and can also generate hydrogen through electrolysis. I'm going to talk a lot more. I have a whole slide on hydrogen later, so I'll move on for now. One thing you hear about in the chemicals industry is CO2 use. So let's say you captured some CO2, what do you want to do with it? Well, you can pump it underground, but there's also the idea of using it in different chemicals and different products. The chemicals industry has some opportunity for this, but the point of this is to show the scale. So reuse of CO2 is most effective when you're going to a molecule that's structurally and energetically similar to CO2. You can see urea and formic acid down there have low heat of formation per carbon atom. They're energetically similar to CO2, and you can form them out of CO2 fairly readily. But a lot of these other chemicals, most of the chemicals that the chemicals industry produces are higher energy molecules that require a lot of energy input. So you either need to devote that energy here, or maybe you can provide the service in another way using the energy directly. That can often be more cost effective. So now I'm talking about cross-cutting technologies, not specific to one industry anymore. And the first of those cross-cutting technologies is electrification. So the graph here is for the whole United States, not just for California, and it shows how industries use their energy. Electricity, and I've put in the site-to-source losses, that's for energy transformations and such. And then the fuels is for thermal fuels, so that's all natural gas, coal, everything they burn on site. And you can see that in the fuels area, it's dominated by two bars: boiler fuel in light blue and process heating, that's heating various materials, melting iron ore and such, in orange. So these are some of the most promising areas to think about when you're looking at electrification. The one key challenge with electrification is cost, because right now, if you're using heat, just to heat a boiler or something, it's cheaper to do it by burning fossil fuels on site than by using electricity with resistance heating to generate the same temperatures. So there are a number of technical solutions that can help us overcome this cost challenge. One is to point out that heat is not always used efficiently. Even if you can generate it efficiently, if a lot of the heat is lost and doesn't make it into transforming the product, that could still be inefficient. So some of the thermal heating applications, that's the process heating we were talking about on the previous slide, can be quite inefficient in their use of heat. And electrification, if it can deliver the energy more precisely, can result in savings. Similarly, with bullet 2 there, you can sometimes apply heat in a more limited and targeted way, like laser sintering and electric arc furnaces. Then there's the idea of avoiding the use of generating all this heat. So in some cases, you might be able to achieve the necessary product creation using another technology. Some that are more at the research stage are ultraviolet light and electron beams for different processes. And then some processes, this is particularly applicable to the food and beverage processing industry, don't need extremely high temperatures, and then a heat pump can be used. A heat pump is more efficient than electrical resistance heating and can be very effective. And or the other way to deal with the cost challenge is, of course, just to make the renewable electricity cheaper than thermal fuels, which policies can help with. This is the slide I mentioned on hydrogen. So it's difficult to electrify all industrial processes, at least in the next couple decades, due to technical challenges. But we need to drive down emissions to hit the mid-century goals and so forth. The graph on the right is just showing a bunch of modeled trajectories and how most of the different, these are global, most of the global emissions trajectories that land in a 2 or even 2.5 degrees Celsius range involve reaching global net zero emissions a little past mid-century and negative thereafter. But remember, this is global, and California is a leader. So if the globe has to do this by 2060-something, California really has to do it earlier because California is always going to be ahead relative to many other places. So we need a zero-carbon thermal fuel. And hydrogen or hydrogen-derived fuels or energy carriers like ammonia or methane that you form using hydrogen could be an important piece of this puzzle. So briefly, hydrogen can be burned for high temperature, used as a chemical feedstock. It burns cleanly, so you can do it in the middle of cities without air quality impacts right there. It has certain challenges regarding its storage and transportation. So then more R&D can help to bring this technology more to fruition. The other key thing that I'll mention here is material efficiency. So the idea of providing the same service or even a better service while using less material. So there are lots of ways to do this. For example, in buildings, if you want to use less concrete, instead of using the traditional square-edged molds for all shapes, you can use these curved fabric molds, which can achieve similar or better strength with less concrete in some places. You can also do things like pre-tension the concrete with steel cables that are then removed, or simply using more different sizes of steel beams. This is actually an example I borrowed from Rebecca, where if you have 20 different sizes of steel beams, you use exactly the one you need in a given place, you can save a lot of material, but it makes it more complicated to build the building. That's one reason why buildings are often built with a more limited set of different sizes and material is overused. Product longevity I mentioned, the longer it lasts, the less often you replace it. Additive manufacturing can deposit material more exactly where you need it and help with lightweighting of parts and components, and repurposing, reuse. The circular economy is a term for this, for a sort of set of ways to reduce material usage, and those are the blue arrows on the right. This might be a little hard to read depending on where you're sitting, but The left side is all about renewable energy. Right now I'm going to focus on the right side, and it's simply trying to illustrate the idea that you put each product or material to its highest and best remaining possible use. So you have a product, and when the user doesn't want it anymore, well, first you can maybe extend its lifetime, so the user wants it longer before it breaks or wears out. Then maybe it can be repaired. If it's not suitable for repair anymore, maybe it can be given to someone else who wants it. If that doesn't work, you can maybe remanufacture or refurbish it. Remanufacture would be disassembling it and reusing pieces. And then recycling would be breaking it down into materials and reusing those. So that covers this technology portion. I'd like I have just a couple extra minutes. You may remember David mentioned that I work on a computer model, and the computer model is publicly available, and I'm just going to take a couple really quick minutes to show you all this model, and thank you. And then you can explore it on your own time. We won't have time to go deeply into it here. The model is available at energypolicy.solutions. There's actually a number of versions right now, and a California version is going to be released soon. The California version is not yet public, so we'll be using the US version for this demo, and you can get to it at energypolicy.solutions. The US one is prefixed with US. The simulator takes the emissions trajectory, in this case of the US. It can show targets. In this case, this is the 2025 target from the United States commitment to the Paris Accord. Right now it's showing two scenarios, some business as usual and something called new scenario. You only see one line because new scenario is right on top of business as usual. We haven't added any policies to it yet. The left side has a bunch of different policies you can enable. They're divided by sector. We'll look at some of the industry ones in a moment. I'm going to show you cross-sector, for example, carbon capture, carbon pricing. If we look at carbon tax, you can further apply it to different sectors. So if you click on a policy, it brings up a pane with a slider. You can slide the slider to a different value. It will think and it'll actually calculate the effect of the policy in real time. It's running the model on the server. I'm going to hit OK. I'll show you that this is a comparisons pane where there are a number of existing scenarios that are built into the tool. For example, I'll just enable a couple of them. One that hits the US NDC, one that we had Energy Innovation recommended. Hit OK, it'll add them to the graph. That's the one we just created, new scenario with just one policy in it. Here are the two we just enabled. There are lots of different graphs you can look at. I'm going to switch back to the business as usual case, discard the scenario we just made. We won't need it anymore. In fact, I'll even remove it from the graph because it's the same as the business as usual. So there are many graphs. For example, you can look at electricity and generation capacity by type, coal, natural gas, et cetera. That's generation. This second tier menu navigates to others. You can look at, so some of these graphs only apply when you have policies. So I'm going to going to toggle to the Energy Innovation recommended. You can see how it changes the electricity mix. If we want to look at, for example, human health and social benefits, we can see this is the number of human lives in the United States saved per year from reduced particulate emissions under different policy packages. You can look at transportation. You can look at for example, the fleet composition by technology. This is a very aggressive package with a vehicle electrification mandate, driving in more electric vehicles here, and so on and so forth. So I don't have time to go through this all. I'll let you explore it on your own time, but there'll be a California version of this online quite soon. And thank you very much.
Great, and I'll make sure, Jeff, that gets posted to the extent that we can when we're posting your slides. Well, thank you for that. Tom, who's with Campbell Soup Company.
Well, I'd like to thank Carb and David for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to talk a little bit about the food processing sector, and tomato processing is where I work specifically. Prospects for decarbonization. So I'm just going to run through real quick some of the background, just for people that might not be aware. California is the largest producer of processing tomatoes in the world, with an average of nearly 1/3 of the world tonnage. The growing conditions, which include warm, dry summers, are ideal in the Mediterranean climate that is prevalent in the Central Valley. The harvest usually begins in early July and extends to mid to late October. So those of you who drive a lot in the Central Valley, you're going to start seeing those tomato trucks soon. The development of determinate tomato varieties, which ripen all at once, mechanical harvesting helps spur the growth of the industry here. So this shows world tomato production graphically in 1989. So you can see California sort of stands alone. You got Italy is another large one, Mediterranean region in general. And then in 2017, so you know, the big one probably to notice is like China came out of nowhere from 100 tons way up there. So things have developed over time. And this is just showing the top 10 tomato processing countries in the world. The top 10 countries would account for probably around 85% of all production in the world. So what are the benefits to processing tomatoes? They're harvested at the peak of ripeness and then delivered to processing plants. This allows processors to lock in nutrients and flavors present in the ripe fruit. Various products are made with the tomatoes, but the vast majority of the overall tonnage is used to produce bulk tomato paste and diced tomatoes that can easily be shipped and used by food processing facilities around the country and around the world to make all those products you're familiar with. So this just shows, you know, out in the fields, harvesting in the factory, a couple pictures. And then these are some of the products that Campbell Soup specifically makes. Not only the soup that everyone is probably familiar with, but things like Prego spaghetti sauce, V8, paste salsa. So greenhouse gas emissions from tomato production. Processes that produce tomato products like tomato paste and diced tomatoes use heat in many steps. And that's pretty common in food processing in general. I think, you know, cheese and dairy is another big sector in California as far as emissions are concerned. Dehydrators, but food processing in general uses steam as heat. That heat, as I mentioned, is supplied by steam, which is created by combusting natural gas in large boilers. Making tomato paste requires evaporating water from tomato juice to concentrate the amount of solids from an initial 5% to 30% or more. Most tomato processing nowadays is aseptic, and steam is used to create a sterile environment as well. Aseptic products don't require refrigeration once they've been produced. So you can store them for a long time and they won't spoil. So I'll just talk a little bit about the focus on energy efficiency in our facilities, kind of the areas that we try to focus on and the technologies we use. So the first area would be boilers. So every year we're tuning and source testing our boilers to make sure that they deliver maximum efficiency across a wide range of firing rates, and also that they minimize the amount of emissions that are generated. Feed water economizers preheat water entering the boilers with the residual heat from exhaust gases, increasing the overall efficiency. And we're returning hot condensate and even hot tomato evaporate water to the boilers, which reduces the need to preheat boiler feed water. Virtually all steam pipes and heat exchangers are insulated to prevent heat loss. So that's just a graphic of a large water tube boiler, which is pretty common in tomato processing facilities. Another area that we focus on is evaporators. Evaporation of water from tomatoes to create tomato paste is a critical process that is also very energy intensive. Steam from the boilers is used to drive turbines coupled to large evaporator circulation pumps and vapor compressors as well. The exhaust steam from these turbines is used to heat the tomato paste in the evaporators, effectively using a large percentage of the overall energy contained in the natural gas fuel. Multiple effect evaporators and mechanical vapor recompression, or MVR evaporators, are used to increase the amount of water evaporated for each pound of steam. So this is a picture just looking at some of the evaporators and flash coolers, cooling towers at one of our facilities here in California. You can think of them as like giant boiling pots of tomato juice. This is kind of a schematic of a triple effect evaporator. And so when I'm talking about effects on evaporators, it just really refers to how many effective uses of the steam do you get. So this is a double effect evaporator. You're using steam from the boilers to heat up the first effect, and then the vapor from that boiling tomato juice in the first effect is going to heat the tomato juice in the second effect. And then the vapor from that is going to a condenser. It condenses, creating a vacuum which runs backwards through the process and allows that juice to boil at lower than ambient temperature. So, we're achieving boiling, in some cases at like 140 degrees rather than 212. And then you can add additional effects. So this would just be a diagram of a triple effect. And there's quadruples, but beyond that, you don't really see anything. It starts to become, the equipment costs become maybe like a diminishing returns type situation. Another focus we have, this isn't necessarily direct emission, but electrical efficiency for indirect emissions. So we have a lot of electric motors driving pumps, fans, air compressors. We're using high efficiency models and a lot of times have automated controls and variable speed drives to minimize electricity use. As the share of renewable electricity grows in California's power mix, the impact of indirect emissions from power is lessened, and we know that's occurring over time. I think our utility PG&E is about 33% or so now renewable. And this is just a picture showing variable frequency drives, which have really, probably within the last, I would say, 5 years or so, come down in cost and been much more easy to adopt in different processes. So that's been a good development. Just talking about prospects for decarbonizing the tomato processing industry. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we're dealing with in the food industry. I mean, when you're thinking about the food you eat, probably not your first thought is how much energy and carbon emissions went into producing this. Maybe it is, but a lot of people want to know first and foremost that it tastes good and it's safe. So the processes that we use have been fine-tuned to maximize efficiency, throughput, and reliability. These are all key factors in controlling the cost of production. Because processed tomato products are produced in many areas throughout the world and can be cost-effectively shipped, they are essentially a commodity and low-cost producers are able to gain market share. Current alternatives to using natural gas to create the steam for process heat are either much too expensive or not able to operate at sufficient capacity to be implemented commercially. Programs investing in innovative technologies are helpful and may help drive improvements in the economics of processing equipment and techniques that reduce carbon intensity of the industry. The amount of emissions reductions required to keep pace with the reductions in the greenhouse gas cap will not on their own be able to be met just by incremental efficiency improvements because most of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. There's been a focus on efficiency for many, many, many years. Electrification of steam generation would require major investments in electrical infrastructure and electricity costs that are an order of magnitude lower than what they are currently to be competitive. If an internationally accepted GHG emission control mechanism is not developed, California producers are likely to be at a competitive disadvantage, leading to emissions leakage. So, one thing I'll call out, the Energy Commission has a food production investment program, uses funds from the, I think I have this wrong on my slide, is it the California
No, it's a
Carbon?
greenhouse gas reduction fund.
Okay.
We got that corrected.
Okay. It has 2 tiers that fund carbon reduction products or projects in food processing. Tier 1 is focused on drop-in energy technologies, and Tier 2 is focused on emerging energy technologies. companies are required to provide a minimum of 35% matching funds for Tier 1 and 15% for Tier 2. Awards to tomato processors thus far have been for the mechanical vapor recompression pre-evaporators or electrical microgrids. But there have been many other awards for other categories of food processors. So, you know, I'm just gonna hit on this really quick. I do like to think about what would be possible if there are certain technologies that were out there that we could cost effectively implement. So these are just some thoughts I have, you know, and I really like to have conversations with people that are interested in the same type of subject. But, you know, concentration without evaporation. There are some studies that have been done on a combination of forward and reverse osmosis to pull water out of the tomato juice at much less of an energy cost. So that's something that may be possible, but it's in the developmental stage now, I would say. Renewable fuels as affordable as fossil fuels and identical in function to be able to use the same infrastructure as natural gas currently does, and we could even use the same boilers potentially. Extremely cheap renewable electricity for electrification. You know, electric-fired boilers, in some sense, are really good, but there's so much cost in electricity in California that it's not viable, anywhere close to viable. You know, if you had an electrification mandate, I don't think we could stay in business. So it's something to work on. It's not there yet. Solar thermal is another possibility. I think there are some facilities that have looked at installing this, especially under the FPIP. For seasonal industries, it's very difficult to figure out what you're going to do the rest of the year with all that solar thermal. So, and then there's, you know, your imagination. What else could there be? So just some ideas, and I think that's my last slide. So thank you.
Tom, thanks so much for that industrial perspective on this. Let's move over to Perry with EPRI.
Okay, thank you, Mark and David and Carb for inviting us, and thank you all for hanging with us here a little bit this afternoon. So EPRI is a nonprofit funded primarily by the electric utility industry. We also receive smaller portions of funding from government entities as well. We're a global organization. We have operations in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. We do everything from basic research on physics and chemistry through all the way through market and research and everything in between. And we cover the entire gamut of the things that the electric utility industry covers, including generation of all types, transmission, distribution, and end use, which is the part of the organization that I belong to. I have a colleague with me, Srinidhi Krishnamurthy. I'm going to have to scoot at the end of this thing to catch a plane, but Srinidhi's agreed to stick behind and take all the hard questions that I'm going to leave him with. So Srinidhi did a lot of the modeling work behind some of the industrial adoption models that we're working on. And while I'm a little more familiar with the industries themselves, he's the numbers guy. So we're going to kind of take a look at some project work that we've done. I say project, it's a series of projects that include a national electrification study that we dropped at the beginning of 2018. That sort of is a top-down look at a market-wide adoption of electric technologies across sectors. We are drilling those down into state-level assessments and utility-level assessments as we speak. But we've also, in our group, done a great deal of bottom-up analysis, starting with technologies and moving them through the various applicable industries that those technologies apply to. We'll talk about some of the data analytics that we used, how we targeted industries and the results, some cost analysis, and then a little bit on emerging tech and what we kind of think today. So the EPRI approach to this is to look at a U.S. regen model. Basically, it's a top-down, industry level, looking at the consumption of energy, both electric and non-electric sources. We map those technologies, various technologies, to end uses throughout industries that they apply to. And we have gained an understanding through our research of the energy consumption and conversion percentages or efficiencies that are associated with those to arrive at a technical potential. Looking at other Department of Energy sources and so forth, we sort of make sure we map those to make sure everything kind of adds up in the end. And then we take cost data that we know about, the sort of typical costs and size ranges of equipment that replace the fossil fuel technology and other emissions data from various other sources to come up with an economic potential based on energy efficiency or energy costs alone. And we can drill that down to fairly small geographic locations based on where the industries exist. So the data sets that and somebody said earlier, kind of data is the problem. Data is always the problem in this game. Finding good data sets, acquiring those data sets that have some rigor behind them, that we trust and that we can use, so they're in a form that we can use to help model what we think is going to happen. So we use a number of external sources. There's census data. In this case, we did looking at the California economy, data from the census region, looking down to the NAICS code or industry code level, CARB data on CO2 emissions, kind of used to back check some of our numbers to make sure that they were still rational. EPA flight data set, looking at specific facilities to try to make sure we tune the geographic location of the sources of emissions and final energy consumption. Might be familiar with the Sankey diagrams from the DOE. We have our annual energy consumption models that come out of our U.S. region model and gives us BTU data by source and by technology and by industry. We have mapped through research that we have done those technologies, the competing electric technology for each of those end uses, and also developed cost data around that. So I think somebody said earlier, kind of this is the bar chart that shows California's kind of role in industrial output. You can imagine that has a similar, if you were looking purely at fossil fuel inputs, you'd have kind of a similar looking set of charts. So it's a big player and obviously a good place for us to work on our research. So in California, we have assessed these industries, and I think you saw a similar chart, to be those that are most, have the most potential for electrification in terms of the combustion. I want to make sure it's clear this is the combustion of fossil fuels and not other process-related emissions. So you can't really do anything about those process-related emissions other than other technologies that would reduce those process emissions. So kind of see the petroleum, chemicals, and plastics being a big chunk, followed by food and beverage and other sectors. But these six are the comprise about 80% of the fossil fuel consumption. Looking at the county level, and this is important, you can see the different industries: food and beverage, chemicals, petroleum, metals, and agriculture, and kind of the distribution based on premise counts. I'll say we've modified this a bit to account for the number and size of facilities, but it really doesn't change the heat map much. It doesn't change where the opportunity is in terms of the opportunity to impact the industries that are the sources of the emissions. Obviously, Los Angeles County, shows up in all of these industries. You have a little more in the agricultural related industries, obviously in the Central Valley and northern timberlands areas that expand the range of electrification opportunities in those industries a bit more. Why is it important? When you look at electrifying these industries, you got to get power into them. And so it's a really important aspect of the studies that we do. There's a transmission and distribution piece of that and a cost associated with that that has to be addressed. So planning the infrastructure needs to support moving electricity into all those facilities is important consideration. So here are the CO2 emissions by industry kind of lined up. Unfortunately for wood pulp and paper, we don't have data based on the model the way it was constructed in our U.S. region model. It sort of ends up lumped in with all others category. My guess is it's probably the biggest part of the all other manufacturing category, but we just don't have a number to put on that. But you can kind of see where this lines up. Overall, about 35 billion tons of CO2 potential through combustion of fuels. So our modeling, and we look at a lot more than just CO2, but the modeling made a series of assumptions. And again, this was really done through our environmental and energy and environment group, made a series of assumptions about what portions or what proportions of the existing fossil fuel BTUs could be converted. I just provide that for information. You can challenge any of these numbers. It's just documenting what was assumed to start with. We take that and we look at this Sankey diagram, and this is the overall energy consumption for manufacturing from the DOE. There's data available down to the industry level, and we take that industry by industry final fuel inputs, and we look at the way those are proportioned by process, and we identify and map the competing electric technologies that we have experience with to those end uses and attempt to ascertain what portion of those could be convertible to the electric technologies. And so these are the different technologies, and I'll just preface this by saying these are existing, commercially viable, under-deployed technologies, okay? These are not, TRL of 7 or 8. These are available technologies today. They can be deployed. They have been deployed. In many cases, there's some significant level of saturation in certain industries for some of these technologies. For example, induction heating and gear manufacturing is pretty highly saturated. I don't know the exact number, but it's pretty commonly deployed because of the advantages of the technology. So infrared heating, resistance heating, and maybe you'll recognize a few of these, microwave and radio frequency, induction hardening, induction melting, electric arc furnace, and industrial heat pumps. I think we've heard a little bit of all of these today at some point. All viable technologies depending on the industry that you're looking at. We map these, and the mapping sort of is an industry by industry process. On the steam side, you really have kind of 3 options to replace steam. You got an electrode boiler, you got a medium voltage electric boiler. We don't even list sort of the resistance. Steam generators are just kind of not cost effective, other than if they're just kind of a first cost type situation, but otherwise not really cost effective on fuel. And then indirect induction heating, sort of eliminating the need for steam altogether, are sort of the options that you've got to look at there. And medium voltage electric boilers, actually, for a medium-sized or moderately sized steam load, turns out to have some fairly decent capital investment first cost advantages that might make it somewhat attractive. Electrode boilers are very spark spread sensitive, and not many of them in use today. Many of them were installed when gas prices were a lot higher. But that can change. So, and then process cooling and machine drives are sort of bit players, but there are opportunities to electrify fossil fuel-fired machine drives. We map those. These are the percentages that we use to demonstrate or to articulate what technologies can take over what portion of the existing load. It's 100%. Effectively, 100% can be electrified. There's an electric technology that can be used to electrify just about any fossil fuel-fired process you want. The question is, can it be done cost-effectively? Is there any reasonable, path to a cost-effective approach? We go through based on research that we have and experience that we have on our team, and we have developed within our model some numbers around the realistic conversion potential in various industries based on all of those various technologies that we have. And that kind of drops out, and these are California numbers now, an annual billion kilowatt hours of new electricity requirement by industry that we would expect. There's about 20 billion kilowatt hours across the state of California of additional generation, transmission, distribution capacity that you would need. And in the end, you can see the CO2 emissions levels that would be obtained by those various industries. And essentially, that's about a 62.5% reduction in CO2 emissions from sort of the current level to this sort of technical absolute best possible scenario with those conversion potentials that we mentioned. Bad news is we know the cost data around these, and it's about $1,200 plus per ton. Okay, so that's a pretty large number when you're looking at CO2 carbon prices of $100 a ton to try to incentivize and induce the market to move. The point is that the costs to these industries and the benefit to these industries aren't in balance. And so we just heard about the tomato industry. The cost to make those kind of conversions is just unrealistic if you simply look at the fuel or energy savings. And the good news is that's not why anybody's going to make any of these changes in the first place. Okay? So here's a little chart that shows sort of the percentage of the cost of production or cost of value added that is attributable to the fossil fuel that's burned in these various industries. So you see petroleum and paper and primary metals and non-metallic mineral products, in the 6 to 15%-ish of cost of production. That's enough to make you serious about trying to figure out how to minimize those costs, right? Well, so much so that these industries already pay a lot of attention to the cost of their fuels and are constantly looking for ways to reduce those costs. And if there's a great electric technology that's going to help them reduce it, trust me, they will be finding a way to figure out how to deploy that. And they'll be looking at research to help them to do that. So all of these other industries, fabricated metals and even chemicals and plastics and food and beverage, as a percent of cost of production, it's not a big enough number to drive action, okay? So you got to have something else. Something else would have to cause a conversion to an electric technology. And it's these non-energy benefits, non-energy drivers that do that. So in most manufacturing, if you're not sort of planning to be lean, you're probably planning to be out of business in the not too distant future. So gains in productivity, product quality, delivery parameters, flexibility to convert to different product types and so forth, inventory costs and uptime all trump and usually are much more significant opportunities that can be achieved and that are delivered by these electric technologies. You also look at the labor content, the raw material costs. So additive manufacturing was mentioned earlier. Raw material costs are a big driver for why additive manufacturing makes sense in certain product lines. upfront capital, other costs, and so on. Health, safety, and environmental are there. They're important. They're usually addressed because there's a risk or a citation or an incident immediately addressed. Otherwise, they're sort of prioritized and they get money according to whatever the formula is that the firm has overall. But those are the reasons, those are the real drivers for adoption of electric technologies. Looking into the future, the way you read this sort of horizon chart, the current year is this first band, and then 5 more years out, 10 more years out, and all the way out to 2050. And then you can see on the horizontal and vertical axes the different industries that apply. And focusing on industrial and sort of heavy commercial loads, I've circled some industries. Technological advancement is possible and moving forward. And then you look out, for example, in the non-road transportation area, there are a number of, you asked about electric flight. It's out there. We may actually have to move that forward a little bit in time. It's looking kind of interesting right now. Electric farming equipment, electric watercraft, and other non-road vehicles. Looking at petrochemical, you've got indirect induction heating, power to heat. That's in essence providing heat through electric technologies directly. Advanced membrane, hydrogen, and then power to direct chemical synthesis. In the plastics side of the house, you have additive manufacturing for plastic components, and again, electric boilers and heat recovery heat pumps were mentioned before. In the metals industry, induction technologies for melting and ladle preheating actually are quite viable or very nearly viable today. Direct reduction iron to charge electric arc furnace is out there. It's been out there a while. It's still not been sort of demonstrated at scale to be effective. Isothermal melting, electrolysis smelting, and hydrogen to iron was mentioned before. The hybrid prototype in Switzerland that's being developed would be a pure hydrogen fueled smelting system, but not expected to be at scale and economy-wide until way at the end of this time horizon. And then you can see food and beverage induction cooking is one that I'd like to talk to the tomato guys about. There's some pretty good, interesting technology for heating all kinds of fluid and semi-fluid materials that looks pretty interesting to us right now. Concrete, infrared for curing, CO2 cured concrete, and then you look at for the kiln part of the process, the syngas, hydrogen-related fueling, and even synthetic food production. So the impossible burgers even out there when you look at food. And then forest products, some of the same technologies, heat pumps. You've got indoor food production, electric tractors, robotics, robotic harvesting, and hydrogen fuel cell powered tractors are all technologies that are on our radar screen. So to summarize, California is a large industrial footprint. 80% of the fossil fuel consumed, it totals about 768 tera-BTUs of electrification opportunity. Industry is highly concentrated, representing a challenge for getting the infrastructure into those concentrated areas where agriculture and forestry related opportunities would be a little more dispersed. Petroleum industry emissions may, decline with some inversely proportional relationship to EV adoption. We don't really have a handle, anybody's guess how that will look, but the same is possible for non-road transportation if you convert that diesel and gasoline to fossil. But in the end, there are a handful of ready-made technologies that could potentially supplant 20 terawatts or actually result in 20 terawatts of additional electric demand, get you down to 5.5 3/4 million tons of CO2 in California if we were able to find ways to economically adopt those economy-wide. But there's some technical challenges in all of those, and with existing technologies or new technologies, there's going to have to be a fair amount of dollars invested in those new and emerging technologies as well as existing technologies to get them to a point where you don't have problems with leakage to other economies. That's it.
Well, Perry, thank you very much for sharing those results on what you guys have been focusing on with electrification. And Eric is with the CEC and will give us our final presentation on Technology Pipeline Program.
Yeah, thanks, David. So my name is Eric Stokes. I'm representing the Energy Research and Development Division at the Energy Commission. I'll talk a little bit about some of the technology innovations we're seeing that can help support kind of decarbonization in the industrial sector. So I'd like to put this slide up just to kind of show kind of where the space we operate in, kind of the overall technology energy policy landscape. Most of the state's policies kind of fall within this market pool category where you're trying to incentivize adoption of commercial technologies. In the Research and Development Division, we try to provide the push and help bring new technologies to that commercial stage. At any given point, we manage about 350 active projects. For each project, we assign a project manager, and we develop very specific project performance metrics and milestones for each of these projects. And through these 4 programs, we pretty much cover the range of topics in the energy technology sector, including the one today. So David mentioned earlier, one of the core focuses of my office is supporting clean tech entrepreneurship across the state. And this was really driven by what happened several years ago when the VC sector completely got out of clean tech after some high-profile failures and just, I think, a realization that they didn't really understand energy technologies and what it takes to actually bring a new energy technology to the marketplace. And so it kind of forced us to rethink the model for how we start to bring these new technologies to a place where they start to gain interest from the private sector, both on the investment side as well as from customers. And it kind of came down to 3 things. One, we needed to create a better pathway for IP developed at research institutions into entrepreneurial endeavors. Second, it was making sure that these clean startup companies had access and support systems to help them really grow and develop, including access to testing facilities, access to experts that can advise them on business plans, legal advice, how to protect their intellectual property, and other kind of aspects as they grow not just their technology, but their business. And then the third was really trying to provide a stages and gates type process as these new technologies move through the various stages so that we're sending signals both to the private sector as well as the public sector around the technology's merits and kind of where they stand. A few years ago, we kind of established the first phase of this kind of what we call operationalizing the innovation pipeline, which was to reestablish a small grant program, which we call CalSeed. And kind of the big purpose this has served is to give technologies, when they're licensed out of the lab or out of the research institution, that little bit of initial runway towards developing their first prototype. And so the way this works is they apply and they can receive up to $150,000 if selected. They are then eligible to compete in a business plan competition that's hosted for us by Clean Tech Open a year or 2 later after their initial award for an additional follow-on funding. We've complemented CalSeed with a statewide network of technology incubators that really kind of provide the compass for a lot of these startup companies and helping guide them effectively to the resources and the technical assistance they need. I just want to highlight a couple other of these programs. One is in the end of this calendar year, we'll be launching CalTestBed, and this will be a voucher-based program. So startup companies that have developed a prototype, they can apply, and if selected, they will receive a voucher that they can take to any one of a number of eligible testing facilities so that they can have some independent testing and validation done on their technology. And we're really trying to shorten that gap between prototype and field trial studies. Our most recent kind of offering into kind of this pipeline has been the RAMP program, which stands for Realizing Accelerated Manufacturing and Production. We have a lot of technologies. We see a lot of great pilot demonstrations, but they're never able to take that next stage and start to move into the pilot production stage. And so this program's really meant to help assist them start to do that and resemble something closer to their full production they need to really start to meet customer demand when they start getting larger purchase orders. So for the first phase of our program, we've been about 2 years operational, and we've already started to see some good results. So far, companies that have gone through the first phase of the ecosystem have attracted over $100 million in funding. This is a combination of both public and private, but I'd say it's probably about 70% private funding. Another thing is the ecosystem partners, the organizations listed, have been able to get an additional close to $5 million to expand entrepreneurial services within the state, and specifically around the more rural parts of the state where you don't have those robust kind of innovation ecosystems like you do in the Bay Area or Los Angeles. So more kind of Central Valley and Eastern Southern California like Imperial Valley and Riverside. Okay, so now I was going to switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the technology topics that I think we're seeing some promise and examples of technologies and projects within each. So one of those is solar thermal for process heating, and several companies are pursuing advancements around the solar collector. Sun Vapor is a company that's taken a little bit of a different approach, and they've targeted the structural systems that the concentrating solar power systems are mounted on. And the way they've done this is they've designed a construction process that utilizes lumber instead of costly steel structures. And this has opened some doors for them to really start to make the construction process much more efficient and really drive down the installation costs. They're currently received an award from the Department of Energy, and they're working on further driving down the installation costs by developing some robotic installation processes that will even further streamline this. And they think they can get their costs down to something that's consistent with natural gas. Another project we did, so we've heard a lot about kind of the big data. This was a project actually led by UC Berkeley with a technology development partner called LightApp. And they installed their kind of IoT platform at over 100 industrial facilities in California to determine how effective it was going to be. And they targeted, for this kind of pilot field trial study, they targeted the compressed air systems. And through this process, they really worked with the facility managers to think how to really kind of train them on how to kind of pull insights from these data analytics softwares, as well as fine-tune they needed to make to their system. And one facility reported a 30% efficiency gain over the base case. One of the findings we saw is that these industrial customers, when they saw how they stacked up with other customers in that same space, it kind of prompted them to start to pursue more energy efficiency measures. So another company we wanted to highlight was a company called Peripheral that's making a better type of forward osmosis membrane. And they developed a product they call the forward osmosis concentrator that is a potential alternative to thermal evaporation for food and beverage concentrate. So we just completed three pilot demonstrations, actually. One with a winery for grape juice concentrate, one with a tomato juice, and one with a brewery. And it's starting to show some pretty good savings, anywhere from 40 to 80% is what they showed through some of their M&B that was conducted as part of that project. And we're gearing up for another pilot demonstration with Peripheral, this time targeting watermelon juice, especially for freeze-dried products. Another area that I think we're seeing a lot of promise is around non-vapor compression cooling. These are cooling technologies that use solid-state devices, and so they tend to be much more energy efficient than traditional methods. They also have the added values. They don't use global warming refrigerants. So this company, SkyCool Systems, they have a panel that can be attached to the rooftop. And the genesis for this project was how in ancient Egyptian times they were able to make ice in the desert. And that was using a principle called radiative cooling, in which you radiate all the heat away, and that creates kind of a thermal delta that you can use then to provide the cooling effect. They're going to be starting their first pilot demonstration with us at a Whole Foods and then later on at a data center, but they've already targeted cold storage warehouses as well as even refrigerated trucking as potential market applications for their technology in the future. And I wanted to finish on an area where we haven't done a ton of research, but I think we are starting to see some promising technologies. and that's really around the CO2 capture and reuse. One company is Mosaic Materials, and what they have is a technology based on metal organic frameworks, and they've developed these pellets that actually act as a sponge, and they absorb CO2 from gases. And so for our project with them, they piloted at a landfill, and they were able to reduce the energy cost of removing that carbon dioxide from the biogas by up to 40%. About a year ago, they also received additional funding from the Department of Energy to further develop this application for their technology. But it's a technology that solves applications to other sectors within the industrial space. The second company I wanted to highlight is Opus 12. And so they have this modular CO2 conversion device that uses only water and electricity, and from that they can turn CO2 into over 16 different products, including chemicals, plastics, and even fuel sources. Their first market application is for carbon monoxide production in the chemical industry. But more recently, they worked with SoCal Gas, and they were able to successfully demonstrate converting the CO2 from the raw biogas into methane in one step. It's a technology that essentially uses electricity as kind of the input along with water, and from that they think they can make they've demonstrated the ability to make several different types of products. I just wanted to share a few links for more information. The first one is the link to the Energy Research and Development homepage. This is where we have a lot of our project publications as well as our funding opportunities. The second link is to our online project database, which is we call the Energy Innovation Showcase. So this allows people to search by technology topics, by end-use customers, and by geography. We are going to be retooling this over the next 6 months to make it a much more effective tech transfer tool, so more to come. And then we've recently launched kind of the beta of what we call our Empower Innovation website, which is a way to help connect matchmaking and partnerships for funding opportunities, both through the Energy Commission as well as other funding sources.
Well, thank you very much for that slide, Eric. And we'll now shift to a panelist discussion before we open it up to questions from the audience. So for the first discussion topic that I wanted to bring up, I'll ask it in general, and then I'll point to each of the panelists to give their particular expertise in that area. So I'll start with the discussion topic is it possible with current technology to reach deep decarbonization in industry, or are we still waiting for a future technology that can drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So Jeff, you did a pretty big generalization of all these technologies, so I wanted to get your input on that.
Sure, happy to comment. I think that existing technologies can go very far toward decarbonization. Sometimes it's a price barrier rather than a technology barrier. As Perry mentioned, there are lots of ways to electrify different things, and it's mainly cost that is preventing some of those from being used today. So that may not need big breakthroughs, that many of those costs may come down as technology scales up and it gains market, and there's learning effects from producing technologies at a larger scale and so on. And also carbon pricing and other things may raise the cost of alternatives, which again narrows the gap or even lets the electrification or other technologies overtake. When you include process emissions particularly, getting to absolutely zero, no emissions anywhere, some new technologies would be helpful. One that I mentioned was creating carbon-free hydrogen, or from there you can always convert it into methane or ammonia if you need to transport it and use it in existing pipelines. If you want to transport it as hydrogen, you need a new pipeline. But in any case, that would go a long way toward plugging that gap of the things that we don't yet have all the technology we would want for. So I do think there's a role for R&D into new technologies. There's a role for reducing the costs of existing ones. And there's a role for policy in aligning incentives.
And Tom, you've worked on this quite a bit over your last long time with working with Campbell's. And I was wondering, with looking at current technologies that are proven, that have a quality and safety record that you had mentioned before, how do you guys balance looking at increasing efficiencies at current technologies rather than, weighing those out versus adoption of new technologies?
I think, in the food processing industry in general, I mentioned we're pretty conservative as far as adopting new technologies because food safety is paramount, and reliably demonstrated processes are going to be difficult to move away from unless there's a really compelling reason. I think there's definitely prospects for further decarbonization, but it really has to go hand in hand with cost effectiveness. I'm going to try to dance around the policy side, but if we can't take just what's going on in California in a vacuum, we're in competition with other producers worldwide, and if they're not playing by the same set of rules, and we're at a disadvantage. So I think there's prospects, but we have to look and really work towards making those prospects cost effective so that other people are adopting our method of doing things because it's so compelling. That's what being a leader is all about, is showing people a path forward, and I think that's got to be the goal here in California.
Well, thank you. And Perry, you were focusing quite a bit on electrification and with current technologies and some future research that was modeled. And is there a specific limitations on how far we can move California industry towards electrification as a way of deep decarbonization in their processes?
So, I think the technical limitations really aren't there. There's the ability to use electricity to achieve decarbonization as you move the grid to a lower carbon future itself. So with increasing renewables and other technologies, you can certainly get there. I think the limitations are going to be somewhat on the economic side. In other cases, in certain industries, for pulp and paper, for example, they have this vast reserve of existing sort of fuels that they use, and they sort of view themselves as green alternatives already, with the black liquor and the residual cellulosic materials. And so they've got this sort of embedded steam processing that is there, and the backup fuel is natural gas, and it's going to be really difficult to supplant that natural gas as the backup fuel for systems that are already fueled by the sort of free existing residuals from their processes. So that makes it tough to work on a process like that. And the petrochemical side, you have this sort of deeply embedded and integrated steam systems in those facilities. You can start to chip away at pieces of that, like steam tracing, replaced with electric heating of lines instead of using steam tracing, and various tank heating options. But so much of the process, the high pressure, high temperature steam, has been optimized through pinch technologies, pinch techniques, and you end up with heavy stranded, very highly capital intensive, prospects for that industry. So you end up bumping up against some real hurdles, I think, in terms of trying to go deeper with those. So various examples in kind of all the major sectors where you kind of start to hit major economic hurdles that are going to be difficult to overcome without looking only at the energy benefits. You have to start to bring in efficiency, productivity, other benefits to make those go.
Perry, you've talked a lot about like the potential for electrification, saying like really there's a lot of technical opportunity, but really we're really cost limited. I'm just wondering if there's any in California, we're starting to look at time of use pricing. Are there things like work in these areas that can bring down electricity costs, like pricing structures, like storage? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a little bit out of my element when I start to talk about upstream costs for generation and transmission distribution, but it's certainly the overall costs of the infrastructure and so forth are constantly looked at by the utilities, and the utilities are pooling their resources sort of nationally to try to solve some of those problems. But to actually get significantly at the cost and the cost structures and rate structures to help promote, there are approaches to rate design and sort of locational value of load and the benefits of more consistent and general industrial load that have broad benefits for all ratepayers. You have to sort of realize that most of those are regulated, utilities, and they would have to go through rate cases to be able to develop those new cost structures and rate structures. But there is the possibility that some of those could be designed in such a way to be more supportive of electric end uses.
And Eric, when I was looking at your funding slide, I saw that roughly, it almost looked like half of it was going towards promoting energy efficiency with current technologies, while there was another half of it that was looking at developing future technologies, which is what you were focused on with the innovation pipeline. But even the Food Processor Incentive Program, the FPIP, half the money is for current technologies to get them in place, and the other half are tier 2 emerging technologies. How do you guys, make that decision on what needs to be pushed?
So push from a technology standpoint or push by stage of technology?
I would say by the stage.
Part of that's what's is kind of the requirements in these various programs. So with FPIP, there was specific requirements that so much had to go for commercial stage and so much for emerging technologies. With our other programs, such as the Electric Program Investment Charge, the statutes and the requirements from the Public Utilities Commission, which has oversight on those programs which are funded by the ratepayers, essentially specifies kind of the stage of technologies we should focus on. I think that given, it's kind of where we also see being the biggest gap in overall state funding. There's a lot of resources that go towards technologies very much at the commercial stage. The programs I showed up there are pretty much the only ones in California focused more on the early technology development and demonstration stages. Because the funding isn't as big as the other pots, I think it's been important for us to kind of coordinate our investments with the Department of Energy and how we can kind of align with some of their programs, such as the ARPA-E. Several of the technologies I showed up there actually received their initial funding either from SBIR or from ARPA-E, and then received Energy Commission funding to really kind of take that next stage from prototype into some of their pilot demonstrations.
And Tom, have you worked with, how have you found, at your facilities that you work at, the usage for those fundings? Because I believe that you guys have been a part of a number of them, EPIC and FPIP.
We haven't participated in FPIP yet. I think we're still considering some things we might try to propose for a grant. I think there's one in there, the Light app one. We were part of that for compressed air. That was interesting. It's one of the sort of forgotten utilities and processing plants, compressed air, and it uses a lot of electricity. It's not, I would say it's indirectly related to emissions in general, and we've used a lot of the utility rebate programs, I think, because those seem like they're easier to implement, less paperwork in general, so.
Well, thanks for that, Tom. So if you guys could go down the line and maybe just give some final thoughts or closing statements to the group, then we can open up for some questions. Okay, we'll just go straight to questions right now from the audience.
Hi, George Veritas from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Thank you all for your time, and CARB for putting together this workshop and for your very informative presentations. Clearly, there's no lack of new ideas here, and that's always encouraging to see. However, I tend to get nervous when I think about the industrial sector. I think it's a large enough chunk of the emission reduction problem that we have to deal with, and I feel that in addition to everything that's being developed and considered, we should also have some heavy-hitting solution on the ready to make the kind of impact that we would like to see here. So along those lines, I have two things in mind. I think since petroleum refining is considered part of the sector in this framework, carbon capture and geologic storage is one of the technologies that could dramatically reduce emissions from refining, and that's already covered under the LCFS program, and that's excellent news. Now, with regard to any kind of process that requires large amounts of heat, industrial heat, then my sense is that we would do well if we have some kind of drop-in solution that could address the problem, and I think RNG can significantly help in that respect. We estimate that we have tens of millions of biomass available from established or occurring forestry practices, from agricultural residues, but also from planned fire clearing that the state intends to or aspires to carry out to make feasible a significant supply of RNG that can be used as a drop-in fuel and aid towards the carbon neutrality targets that the state may have, and processes that can just receive that fuel without some large-scale retrofit or change in paradigm or technology use. You just use a different fuel, which could be transported from existing established infrastructure, the pipeline network. So I would like to hear your views about the RNG potential here, especially combined with biomass. Thank you.
I would think that that's a very good potential opportunity because it uses existing infrastructure. And if it's competitive, it's not something that would just be confined to California. It could be utilized throughout the world.
I would tend to agree with that. I think anything that's going to make use of existing infrastructure, we have a fantastic electric transmission distribution infrastructure, and if we can extend that and use various fuels to generate electricity, I think there needs to be more work done to establish the overall economic and social benefit of those options versus various other alternatives that we're looking at. So I think further study is certainly warranted to look at sort of a complete supply chain approach. And it's one of the things that I advocate. If I look at the metals industry, the energy profile of the metal industry changes a lot if you go to additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing itself doesn't electrify in great quantities, but the supply chain changes a lot. You have powdered metal and wire production instead of billets, and larger metal forms and subtractive machining. You have post-processing that is sintering and hipping processes that are all electric processes. So it's a different supply chain. We need to take a look at those and compare them to the current or the electrification of the current or whatever our other alternatives are, and kind of say, well, what one looks best?
and making use of those alternative fuel sources, I think, is one of those pathways we got to look at.
And I think that's a big interest in the carbon neutrality series that we're having. And so we have mentioned that we are going to be having a number of these meetings to also move in to discuss more on the energy side and the carbon capture and sequestration side. So I really encourage everyone to keep up on this, on these series of meetings.
Hi, Julia Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California. Again, I want to follow up on George's question. And it's interesting, Perry, because you just made a comment about relying on existing infrastructure and how reliable, I think was the word you used, or robust our electricity infrastructure is. And there's no question we're going to electrify a lot of our energy end uses in California, but I think our electricity infrastructure isn't reliable. It's a huge source of wildfires. The utilities are going to have to turn it off with increasing frequency because of public safety power shutoffs. And so I hope going forward in future workshops that there will also be a presenter, not just from EPRI, but from the Gas Technology Institute or someone on the renewable gas side, because we're going to need both. I think that's really, really clear for reliability, for safety, to get to decarbonization as quickly as possible. I mean, Thomas made the comment from Campbell Soup that they rely on natural gas and they're going to continue to rely on it. And I would just say we could substitute that with biogas or other forms of renewable gas, renewable hydrogen. We don't have to electrify everything, and we probably can't electrify everything. And so, well, that's an important part of the solution. I do urge the Air Board, you know, as this is going to be a very long-term discussion, to incorporate, presenters, experts on renewable gas as well, and the opportunities to use that as part of our decarbonization strategy.
Ken Leati with ADTRA. Thank you for hosting the workshop. A lot of useful information presented. I've got, I think, one question and maybe a comment. So to the EPRI presenter, you gave on page 15 or slide 15 a list of energy benefits that could potentially offset the high cost of carbon compliance. Has EPRI quantified the economic benefits that were listed?
You need to come to work at EPRI because we're asking that question right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so the answer is that is a major part of our research. We actually spent a lot of time recently talking about how to quantify that and what non-energy benefits we had the data to try to do that with, what industries we'd be able to get that data. It comes down to productivity, product quality, and a few other parameters that probably make a lot more impact than other sort of lesser on that list. And we're trying to kind of figure out what that is. And it's going to be an industry by industry analysis. You just can't, sort of smear that like peanut butter and figure that's a good number. So we're going to be working on that. It's some of the research we're doing in our state assessments right now. But it's not a number that we have handily ready. And the costs differ too for those because you're talking about different sizes of equipment for different industries and sort of different ranges of equipment. We've got to really understand all of that and gather that data to do that analysis.
I might be maybe saying this in jest, but we might be able to help EPRI do some of that work because in my prior life at the California Energy Commission, we did a lot of economic analysis of technology assessments, and in my present life, we are looking at different ways of helping deliver low-cost electricity and high heat thermal energy and process steam thermal energy to customers in the C&I, NI segment, commercial, industrial, and institutional segment, as well as the food and ag segment. Now, here's my other question. You estimated the incremental electricity demand of about 20 terawatt hours for the industrial sector from electrification to built on Julia Levin's concern about the emissions from wildfires sourced to electrical equipment. When those emissions are considered, they would add an additional contribution to the California emissions inventory. So it raises the question about how beneficial wide-scale electrification is going to be across all sectors or all segments of California's economy. And I've been pushing my old agency to take a close look at this work, since the Energy Commission has, under the AB 1007 legislation, the ongoing authority to do an additional full fuel cycle assessment of the electricity pathways. I led that work when I was at the Energy Commission, and then transferred that to the Air Resources Board, which informs or is the basis for the low carbon fuel standard. So I think it's a sufficiently important consideration for all of the stakeholders to advocate for either the Air Resources Board or the Energy Commission, or both, to undertake this work.
My only comment is it's not my area. It's transmission distribution folks at EPRI that would be looking at that. I don't know if they're doing any definitive studies. Trinity, have you heard of anything around? I know it's on their radar screen in terms of the risks associated with fires and other hazards associated with electrical infrastructure, but I don't know any definitive studies that are going on there as it relates to emissions from that. So it's a good point.
Good afternoon. John Larea with the California League of Food Producers. Thank you. This was interesting today. One of the things that I do for our members, and I want to say for disclosure reasons, Tom and Campbell Soup is one of our members, is to look for options for them and incentive programs that they can utilize, to drive forward the technologies. One of the things I'd ask you all is, do you think right now that the state is the way they're investing their monies right now in terms of technologies and such, do you think it's going to get there? Or do you think there should be some changes that will be able to both drive the technologies forward and accommodate facilities like Campbell Soup into considering ever more emerging technologies, newer technologies, or riskier technologies?
Sure, so I'll take that. So I think you kind of need a balanced approach of both some near-term technologies that are ready for adoption, because I think part of the challenge is, when is a new technology ready? And so we try to do enough pilot demonstrations to really put some M&V, make sure that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, the technology is still going to be working. I think there's limits to that. We try to do some accelerated testing to make sure that these technologies are going to be durable. But I don't know what the right balance is. I think you definitely need kind of some of these moonshot technologies, because I think especially in the industrial sector, what we've traditionally seen is a lot of incremental improvements, but we haven't seen kind of those technologies that are going to have major advancements in terms of energy savings and greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Thank you. You don't mind. One of the things I noticed was on Mr. Stevens' one of his slides was it was the ones where they showed the sectors, and it's moving forward into the future depending upon the types of technology coming out. If you looked at the food processors one, it ended after the second one. There were just blank spots going forward, which is one of the
looked. I mean, it's kind of not there, other than way out there. There's the artificial food thing,
which is that, and I also noticed that there wasn't any kind of transporter of human bodies, going in the future either. Although I did see human transport drones, so that was kind of interesting. Yeah. But so you can see, industries themselves, especially specific sector industries, are facing problems getting to the future if there's no technologies out there. And I like the moonshots, but one of the things that we're really pleased with the Energy Commission, especially under the FPIP program, is that they went out and they asked us what we need. You know, it wasn't a matter of, you know, give us all your technologies out here and we're going to decide the best ones for that and then we'll push that because that's closer to being able to get it into business. But they went out to our industry itself and said, what do you need? What do you like? What do you want? Which is developed 2 tiers. Hey, we can use all this stuff that's on the shelf, but we also need something that's going to give us a boost going forward. So, you know, so in terms of the funding coming from the state, that's kind of what I'm referring to is that, you know, maybe it's time for the state to reevaluate exactly how they're investing this money. You know, pull the politics out of it and actually, you know, because you gentlemen here are the ones who are going to give them the data that they need to show exactly how you're going to get there and how we're going to get there. And, you know, pull the politics out and start investing in the actual realities that we're facing, especially after 2020.
If I could maybe weigh in and just make a comment. I think, you know, it's important that California also doesn't think that we alone are going to solve the world's problems by ourselves. You know, if we got these big problems and global warming, greenhouse gas emissions are a worldwide problem, we got to be looking for every possible way, I think, to collaborate with people and organizations around the world to make progress on some of these moonshot issues that could get us to a place where we're actually able to have high quality of life, all the products that we're used to, and at the same time be dealing with global warming.
Hi, my name is Elliot Hoffman. My company's name is Rev, but that's not why I'm here today. I'm here for a friend who's got a company in the South Bay who's developed a technology that is quite interesting. It's been tested, piloted, and it has potential to to capture tremendous quantities of carbon profitably and permanently. I'm curious, on your slide, Eric, you had 2 companies that you mentioned sequester carbon, and I'm curious as to what would be their vision? What would be a real win for them in terms of tons of carbon sequestered each year by Mosaic and Opus One? That's one question. My second question goes to what Tom had just mentioned, and that is, I think probably most people here know of New York's new climate legislation. I'm somewhat familiar with it, but I'm wondering also, has there any thought given to California and New York working collaboratively on this? You might look at this as California and New York as pillars for the United States. So can New York and California be the trim tabs to get this country really going? So first, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Eric, on that.
Sure, yeah. So I think for the first question, I'd have to go back to them to find out kind of if they have a target for how much CO2. And I think a lot of that's going to be driven by kind of what their early applications are for their technology. For the 2 projects I highlighted, you know, the real genesis was how do we reduce the cost of biogas cleanup? And really the most expensive step in that is the CO2 removal, which typically requires, you know, these wet scrubbers, some solvents. And so, you know, what they've developed, at least what they've demonstrated, was a much more efficient and hopefully eventually cheaper alternative to that. I'm sure they've done some estimates and some studies around what they think the CO2 capture and reuse could be for the market sectors they're targeting, but I'd have to go back and kind of figure out what that information is. I'll speak a little bit for, at least in the R&D division, we do kind of connect with other organizations that run similar R&D programs. One, there's not a whole lot. There's basically NYSERDA in New York and Mass CEC in Massachusetts, and then the Department of Energy. And so we do have some coordination meetings about kind of sharing best practices, what technology topics they're seeing that look promising, what we're seeing from our end. Specifically with ARPA-E, the Energy Commission, ARPA-E, established an MOU several years ago that essentially operationalized some of the coordination and how do we technologies that might be ripe for ARPA-E funding and then ARPA-E projects that might be right for follow-on funding from the Energy Commission. You know, a big concern for RPE over the years was they're limited by the stage of technology they can fund. So they're required by their statute to support very early stage kind of moonshot technology. So they really have to identify kind of where that funding handoff's going to be. And so we've been able to kind of figure out ways to still make it a competitive process, but have an avenue for some of the most successful RPE companies in California to get follow-on funding from the CEC.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. We have just a couple minutes left. If anyone wanted to share any final thoughts or takeaways for the group.
I'd like to jump in because I do need to go catch a flight. So if it's all right, just real quick, I think from the industry perspective, the individuals that have to make these investment decisions, because ultimately somebody has to make an investment decision for any of this to happen. So you just got to have the reality that somebody's going to decide to invest the money to make whatever the process change is. And the world of carbon and my impact looks fairly diffuse to me as the decision maker, but the impact is fairly concentrated. I'm looking at my process, my plant, the people that work for my plant, my division, whatever the case may be, the dollars that my company has, and ultimately maybe even my job. And so they are very careful and methodical about making those decisions. And so that's one of the hurdles you got to overcome, is that people are using other people's money to invest it. And if they make a mistake, it's their job, their livelihood, their family, whatever you want to look at. And you'd be careful with it yourself, making the same decision. So the result is that the carrots and sticks that we're talking about in this process have to align with the more powerful drivers that are really going to cause them to make that decision, which are these productivity, throughput, improvements in process, all of those things that help to justify projects to move toward technologies that are lower carbon. It has to align with those, otherwise you're putting a little bit of money at a problem that's never going to move.
I guess I'll make my closing comment and bring up again the idea of material efficiency. So we've talked a lot about energy sources and, will it be electrification? Can we make renewable natural gas from hydrogen, from biomass, et cetera? And that's all important. But it's also worth remembering that there's a great deal of abatement potential to be had that doesn't require new technology. Instead, it's substituting smarter design and other techniques for material. Most of the carbon impact in a product is in the materials that embody that product. So if you have a way to build a building that uses less concrete, you can much more rapidly reduce the carbon the CO2 emissions of building buildings than if you improve the energy efficiency of the cement kiln. Both are worthy of research, but the material efficiency is in some sense easier because it just requires good architecture and civil engineering, and also will likely save more carbon, especially in the near term. And then this has benefits all upstream. So then you need less electricity, you need less gas, you need less of everything. And so all of the upstream costs, emissions, and risks are reduced the more cleverly you can do this. And the idea isn't to make do with less. The idea, you still get a building in the end, and it's equally functional. The idea is the building is built in a smarter way. So I'll just, I'll use my closing remark to remind everyone that that's a technique that should be on the table.
Well, I'll just say, I think my company and many other companies are very focused on efficiency and doing more with less and being good corporate citizens in this way and many other ways. But I think it was Perry was talking about, the decisions that have to be made on investment, and he's absolutely right about that. It's tough, and you've really got to evaluate everything and hope that that money you're spending isn't going down a rabbit hole or something like that. So, I think the more information we have, the more pilot studies that have been done, even things like this today and organizing this, I think sharing ideas is very helpful. And it's going to be a process to try to get to where we can reduce carbon emissions to the level that are stated in the state's goals. It's going to be very tough. But I think, we have no other choice than just to move forward and see what we can do. And so I'll be putting one foot in front of the other, and I'm sure everyone else will be trying to do the same.
Yeah, I'll just add that this is a really challenging space. I think for a lot of reasons already mentioned, and I know a lot of our companies, when they approach industrial customers, what they usually hear is, we don't want to be the first customer. We don't even want to be the 100th customer. We want to be the 101st customer. So I think a lot of the challenges with some of these new technologies is, where do you find those first 100 customers to really refine and validate the technology before it is then ready to go to industrial customers? So I think that's a big challenge we see on our end a lot of times.
Well, I really appreciate everyone's input and joining in on this meeting. And I encourage you to submit and view comments on our meetings page. And Mark, do we have anything else?
No, just thank you, everybody, for coming out. I think I just want to echo Tom's comments about the importance of this initial conversation, the idea sharing. We're really looking for all of your input, so I hope that you continue to stay involved. Really appreciate your spending the afternoon with us and kicking your ideas in. It's really useful for us to hear all the different perspectives. I hope everybody else is walking away with this with that perspective too, that there's really a lot of opportunity here, but there's a lot of challenges, and it's not going to be an easy lift. But I think as long as we're cooperating together, it seems like there's paths forward. So looking forward to continuing the conversation as we move forward. So thank you so much, and enjoy your afternoon.